Hey guys, tonight we're slipping quietly past the obsidian-studded walls of Tenochtitlan to explore something the textbooks definitely don't cover in detail, the bedroom politics of Aztec royalty. Yes, we're going there, into the fragrant, smoke-filled chambers of power, where alliances were sealed with silk, bloodlines were engineered like blueprints, and pleasure was never just for fun. You'll be amazed, you'll be mildly horrified. And if we're being honest, you probably won't survive this if you lived it firsthand. Seriously, between the high expectations, sacred rituals, and oh yeah, occasional sacrifices, it was less a fairy tale and more like a season of Game of Thrones, but with jaguar pelts and chili paste. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your city and what time it is where you're watching from. I'm curious who else is up wandering into history's shadowy corners with me at this hour. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing in a stone hall that smells faintly of copal incense and sweat. Soft cotton tapestries flutter near the windows as moonlight spills in, carving shadows across elaborate murals. Here, in the palace of the Tlatoani, the Speaker King, sex is not private. It is political, spiritual, regulated, and performed beneath the gaze of ancestors and gods alike. Let's start with how power and procreation were entwined from the very roots of Royal Aztec society. Unlike the modern Western notion of marrying for love, oh, cute, Aztec nobles approached sex and marriage like generals planning a campaign. Everything had a purpose. The emperor or Huey Tlatoani didn't just marry one wife. He married dozens, and not because he was collecting Tinder matches, each union was a treaty. Every bride represented a conquered region, a noble ally, or a religious sect that needed placating. So imagine your job isn't just to rule the empire, it's also to keep 30 politically sensitive wives happy, manage their jealousies, and produce heirs with the correct mix of sacred and social legitimacy. Romantic, huh? But it goes deeper. In Aztec cosmology, sexual energy wasn't just biological, it was cosmic. Your body was a container of tonali, a divine heat energy gifted at birth and sustained by acts of discipline, honour, and, yep, sex, but only the right kind. Royal blood was believed to carry a special potency, divine ancestry traced back to the Toltecs, or even gods like Quetzalcoatl. So when a royal couple had sex, they weren't just doing the horizontal flower dance, they were performing a ritual reaffirming the celestial order. Now you, standing in this palace, might expect this all to feel grand and luxurious, and in a way, it is. The emperor's chambers were lined with feathered blankets, fine cotton sheets dyed with cochineal reds, and soft reed mats underfoot. But look closer. Notice the incense burners shaped like deities, the painted skull motifs on the walls, and the small sacrificial blade near the altar in the corner. Yeah, intimacy here comes with a side of divinity and doom. And while all this sounds controlled and calculated, here's the quirky part. The Aztecs actually had a powerful moral code around sex, but only when it applied to others, royalty, exempt. Technically, rulers were expected to be paragons of moderation, but in practice, well, Moctezuma reportedly had so many concubines the Spanish were scandalized, and those were guys who literally came from an inquisition, but not all scholars agree on just how hedonistic the royal court was. Some insist that reports of massive harems and sexual excess were exaggerated by Spanish chroniclers eager to portray the Aztecs as decadent pagans deserving of conquest. Others say those reports might not have gone far enough. After all, oral histories speak of palace rituals where the emperor would engage in ceremonial intimacy during solar eclipses to reignite the sun. Now that's performance pressure. Here's another spicy reality check. If you were a noble, having sex with the wrong person could get you killed. If you were a commoner and caught even looking sideways at a royal consort, forget it. You wouldn't just lose your head, you might lose it in public during a festival, as a warning. And yes, sometimes that punishment involved skinning. The Aztecs were big on skin motifs, and making examples of people, still feeling envious of the royal lifestyle. There's something eerie about how intertwined sexuality was with every layer of Aztec elite life. Fertility, agriculture, cosmic cycles, power. All roads led back to the bedchamber, the altar, or sometimes both. One moment you're feasting beside the emperor, the next you're watching a flower-clad virgin chosen for her beauty march toward a stone slab, her chest bare to the sun and fate. Not all rituals involved sacrifice, of course, but enough did that it cast a long shadow over the concept of sacred union. And yet these practices weren't crude or chaotic, they were deeply symbolic. The Aztecs saw human beings as echoes of the divine. Your fluids, sweat, blood, and yes, semen, were literal offerings, not metaphorical. Every release was a gift to the gods, especially to deities like Tlaloc or Xochipilli, patron of flowers, pleasure, doutor, and homosexuality. That's right, queer identities had a place in the pantheon too, although their social standing was complicated. More on that in a later section. So now, standing here as the moon slips behind clouds and the wind rustles the tall reeds outside, you begin to understand that for Aztec royalty, sex wasn't about choice. It was about duty, about aligning yourself with the heavens, sealing alliances with your body, and becoming a conduit for the life force of the empire. And just think, this is only the beginning. You're still standing in the palace. The heavy air scented with resinous smoke and crushed marigold petals, but now we follow the rustling trail of soft sandals down a corridor lined with obsidian mirrors. These are not just for vanity. Each mirror reflects the many faces of royalty, including the many wives the emperor was expected to maintain. You're about to witness matrimonial multiplication on an imperial scale. For Aztec royalty, one wife was just a starter. Like having one corn tortilla at a feast, it technically counts. But no one's impressed. Polygamy wasn't a lifestyle choice, it was an absolute necessity. The more noble women an emperor married, the more alliances he forged, and the more tightly woven his empire became. Every marriage created a thread of loyalty. Every child born of those unions became a potential ambassador, priest, or future noble in a distant city-state. And if you think that sounds exhausting, well yeah, you'd better be good with names and birthdays. Let's zero in on the emperor himself. The Huey Tlatoani was expected to marry the daughters of rival rulers, military captains, religious leaders, and even influential merchants. These weren't just women, they were walking treaties. Their dowries included land, featherwork, cacao, and in some cases, entire villages, and in return, they got to share a husband with 40 or more other women. Lucky them. Now here's the quirky bit. Only the principal wife, or Cihuacotl, held the highest status among the harem. She was usually of equally royal blood and bore the children with the best shot at inheriting power. The rest, ranked quite literally by bloodline, political importance, and sometimes just availability. It was a weirdly bureaucratic love life. Each wife had her own chamber or suite, managed her own servants, and followed a strict rotation schedule to spend time with the emperor. Honestly, it was like an elite boarding school, but with more obsidian jewellery and way more at stake. This polygamy extended beyond the emperor too. Any nobleman with the resources and influence to support multiple wives was encouraged, almost expected to do so. But it wasn't about satisfying desire. It was about expanding influence and guaranteeing a lineage. The Aztecs were deeply concerned with posterity. Having many children, especially sons, was both a blessing and a civic duty. And for the women, their value was closely tied to fertility. A noble woman who bore many healthy children, especially warriors, could elevate her family's status. In a way, the womb was a battlefield of its own. Of course, all of this came with rules. The Kalmakak, schools for noble youth, taught proper etiquette for courtship and marriage. Boys learned that sex outside of wedlock, especially with the wives of others, could be punishable by death. Girls were raised to become refined, modest, and dutiful, but once you married into the upper echelons, it wasn't exactly a domestic fairy tale. Imagine living in a massive palace surrounded by women who might smile at you in the day but whisper curses into clay figures by night. Some reports mention bitter rivalries, secret hexes, and even poisonings within the palace walls. Being wife to 17 meant you had to get creative to earn favour, and if you caught the emperor's attention for too long, you risked making enemies out of some very powerful women. Scholars debate just how formalised these royal harems were. Some argue the structure was loose and fluid, guided more by custom than law. Others believe it was meticulously organised, with administrators keeping track of who slept where, when, and for what political purpose. There's even a theory that certain nights, especially those aligned with specific calendar dates, were reserved for procreative rituals, while others were considered taboo for intimacy. Cosmic timing, once again, was everything. But don't get it twisted, this wasn't some utopia of mutual understanding and open love. Many of these women had no say in their marriages. They were traded like treasure, valued for their family ties more than their personalities. A teenage girl from a distant city might find herself suddenly swept into the capital, given a new name, new clothes, and a husband she'd only ever seen from afar. If she was lucky, she might live comfortably. If not, she could fade into the labyrinth of chambers, forgotten and alone. Yet some wielded immense power from behind the scenes. The principal wife often held sway over palace decisions and raised the future heirs. Others gained influence through cunning, bearing children who grew into priests or military captains. And occasionally a lower-ranked wife would win the emperor's favour through charm, intellect, or sheer political usefulness. It was a hierarchy that shifted with births, deaths, and alliances like some slow-moving celestial dance. Now, let's pause for an odd footnote. Despite their heavy emphasis on fertility, the Aztecs also practiced forms of birth control. Yeah, maize silk, crushed insects, and even prolonged breastfeeding were all used by women to space out pregnancies. Some historians suggest noble women may have shared this knowledge discreetly, especially when court politics made bearing more children risky. And what about love? Was there any of that? Maybe. Somewhere beneath the layers of ritual and protocol, it's likely some of these unions did spark genuine affection. After all, these were real people, not just chess pieces in jaguar-patterned robes. They laughed, cried, and probably gossiped, just like anyone else. But if they did fall in love, they had to play it cool, especially when the eyes of the gods and dozens of jealous co-wives were watching. As you walk deeper into the palace, past courtyards blooming with cacti and hummingbirds darting like coloured sparks, you start to see how exhausting it must have been to live like this. Love, duty, blood, and power intertwined like vines with thorns. There's beauty in the structure, sure, but also a profound, almost invisible loneliness. Because in the end, the emperor may have slept beside a different woman every night. But when dawn broke over the volcanic peaks, he stood alone, responsible for an empire that demanded everything, even the shape of his most private life. You're wading deeper into the ritual steam of palace life now, where the difference between holy and human is thin as smoke. Down another hallway, you hear soft chanting, the rhythm low and breathy, like the cooing of doves echoing through stone. Follow the sound, and you'll find yourself in a courtyard garden veiled in hanging orchids and flowering vines. At its centre stands a small circular shrine, delicate, simple, and guarded by a single obsidian-eyed priestess who lowers her gaze as you pass. This is the house of the sacred maidens, and surprise, not everything here is as chaste as it seems. The Aztecs loved their paradoxes. Warriors who were also gardeners, gods of both filth and purification, and virgins who, well, might not have been. These temple maidens, often called Chuatlamakask, were priestesses devoted to the service of gods like Xochiquetzal, the goddess of beauty, love, and young women. In theory, they were paragons of virtue, unmarried, untouched, and cloistered from the temptations of the flesh. They were the sacred vessels through which divine purity flowed into the realm. But in practice, things were a lot murkier. The role of these sacred virgins wasn't simply to abstain, it was to represent an ideal, an unattainable purity that could be symbolically offered to the gods. Many of these girls were chosen at a young age, plucked from noble families and trained in cloistered Kalmakak schools where they learned songs, rituals, textile arts, and how to remain silent unless spoken to. They lived under strict supervision, but not necessarily total isolation. That's where things got complicated. Because despite all the rules, no men, no nighttime wandering, no touching, rumours persisted of secret liaisons between temple maidens and high-ranking nobles. And if you think rumours in the Aztec Empire meant idle gossip, think again. Sometimes they led to death. A virgin caught in an affair could face brutal execution, often in a public ritual designed to cleanse the temple. Her lover, if he wasn't powerful enough to bribe his way out, might find himself flayed alive or turned into a sacrifice during a major festival. But here's the fringe fact that gets buried under all that blood and incense. Some of these trysts were not only tolerated, they were orchestrated. In certain fertility rituals, a temple maiden might be married symbolically to a god. And how did that happen? Through a ceremony involving a nobleman who would impersonate the deity, complete with masks, chants, and yes, sexual union. All of it was wrapped in a ribbon of religious justification. The girl might be paraded as divine bride, then quietly removed afterward, sometimes rewarded, sometimes discarded, depending on the outcome. there's still an open scholarly debate about how common these divine unions were. Some researchers argue they were rare exceptions, tightly controlled and spiritually justified. Others suggest they were more frequent than records admit, masked by the secrecy of temple walls and a willingness to rewrite history. It's hard to say, especially when most surviving texts were filtered through Spanish eyes already eager to paint the Aztecs as sinful and depraved. But let's imagine just for a moment that you're one of these maidens. You've lived your life under a strict vow, your hair always braided a certain way, your meals plain and measured. One day a priest approaches you and says you've been chosen to embody the goddess. You're dressed in elaborate feathered robes, perfume with sweet sap and adorned with flowers. That night, a nobleman in a golden mask enters your chamber, kneels before you, and recites a prayer meant to awaken divine union. You're not allowed to speak. You simply lie back and let the ritual unfold. Sacred? Maybe. Surreal? Definitely. And afterward, you might be returned to the temple, or quietly sent off to live in another city-state, your purpose fulfilled. You've become a walking symbol of divine fertility, used, sanctified and erased all at once. Of course, not every priestess went through such ceremonies. Many lived genuinely cloistered lives, devout and untouched, their time devoted to weaving, chanting and preparing offerings. Some served well into old age, becoming matronly guides to the next generation. Others left the temple to marry into noble households once their term of service ended. It wasn't always a grim fate. But the pressure, the constant gaze of priests, the risk of rumours, the razor-thin line between purity and punishment was always there. And here's a strange little side note. One ritual involved maidens bathing naked at dawn in cold mountain springs as part of a rain ceremony. According to some oral traditions, these baths were meant to invite Tlaloc's blessings, though more than one account hints that these moments were also observed from a distance by male priests to ensure correctness. Surveillance disguised as sanctity. Not creepy at all. Still, not all breaches of celibacy were punished equally. If a maiden was particularly beloved or politically important, her indiscretion might be covered up. Maybe she got reassigned. Maybe she was retired early. Maybe a convenient marriage was arranged. The palace had its ways, and the gods, conveniently, weren't always paying attention. As you wander through the quiet courtyard, you notice a circle of carved stone seats. This was likely where the maidens sat in evening reflection, braiding each other's hair and singing soft hymns. You can almost hear their voices now lilting, like the wind through the reeds, speaking in tones that only half trusted the rules. They lived in a cage made of gold and silence, balancing devotion with danger every day. And whether they were truly celibate or not, that's a secret the stone never gave up. Past the gardens of the sacred maidens, you follow the scent of crushed rosewood and the rustle of fine cotton robes, until you reach a chamber unlike the others, larger, quieter and more heavily guarded. You can tell by the thickness of the walls and the nervous way servants flit past that someone important lives here. This is the residence of the favourite, the emperor's principal wife, the Cihuacoatl, and her presence looms in every carved lintel and folded petal of the embroidered hangings. Tonight, you'll see what it meant to be loved, worshipped, and possibly despised, all at once. Being the favourite wasn't just about beauty or charm, it was about bloodline. The principal wife of the emperor was almost always of pure noble descent, usually a close relative, often a cousin or even a half-sister. That's right, marrying within the family wasn't frowned upon at the highest level. It was expected. The logic was simple, if slightly unsettling. Preserve the divine blood, keep the power consolidated, and limit outside influence. So while the emperor might have dozens of wives, only one could give birth to an heir with a truly unbroken celestial pedigree. Imagine the pressure. As the principal wife, your days were regimented to the hour. You woke before dawn, attended private prayers, received daily reports from stewards and ladies-in-waiting, and participated in ceremonial observances, but all of that was mere scaffolding. Your real job? Manage the palace's emotional economy, keep the other wives in check, mediate disputes, know who was whispering what behind whose curtain. You weren't just a wife, you were a quiet warlord in a dress stitched with hummingbird feathers. Some accounts suggest that the emperor's favourite wielded soft power greater than that of many male nobles. She could whisper in his ear before major decisions. She had influence over which sons were favoured, which priest received donations, and which noble daughters got chosen for temple service. Of course, none of that was official. There were no edicts signed on behalf of the Quetzalcoatl. Her power was felt, not seen, like a breeze shifting the coals of a fire. But here's the dark twist. Being on top didn't mean you were safe. If another wife caught the emperor's eye and bore him a son, palace politics could shift overnight. The favourite might find herself slowly pushed into ceremonial roles, her influence diluted by new alliances and younger, hungrier rivals, and in the worst-case scenario, accusations of sorcery, of manipulation, of withholding sex, all of which were punishable by death, because even power in bed came with terms and conditions. There's one especially spicy story told in fragments, barely pieced together from a few codices and some Spanish transcriptions, about a principal wife who allegedly cursed another consort's child. The baby died mysteriously just before a key festival, and for weeks afterward, the palace was filled with omens, dead birds, cracked obsidian, water that refused to boil. The emperor didn't accuse her outright, but the following year, she was sent away for health reasons. No record of her death. No mention of her return, and it wasn't just women who feared her. Ambitious male courtiers, especially those from newly conquered regions, knew that the favourite's opinion could sway the emperor. If she didn't like you, your land request might get denied. Your family might never receive full tribute status. You could spend decades in limbo, forever a servant to someone whose face was never unpainted. Yet for all her clout, the favourite's life was still wrapped tightly in protocol. She couldn't leave the palace unescorted. She couldn't speak to men outside the noble class. Her letters were copied and archived. Even her food was double-tasted, not just for poison, but for omens. If the tamale broke strangely or the cacao curdled, priests might halt her meetings until they performed a cleansing rite. And what about her relationship with the emperor? That's where the scholarly debates heat up. Some believe that these were deeply strategic pairings, cold but respectful. Others argue that some emperors were genuinely affectionate with their favourites, relying on them for emotional balance in the chaos of court life. There's even one poetic fragment that describes an emperor weeping in his favourite's arms the night after a failed campaign. His feathered war crown crumpled at his feet. Maybe real intimacy existed in the midst of all that pressure. Still, one thing is certain, sex between the emperor and his principal wife wasn't just personal. It was national business. Their union symbolised order. Their children were cosmic gifts. Every public ritual that involved them, like walking hand in hand during a harvest festival or sitting side by side during a lunar eclipse, was designed to reflect balance between male and female energy, war and peace, sun and moon. And yes, even their private time had ceremonial weight. Some nights were chosen specifically for intimacy, according to the ritual calendar. Certain constellations, the phase of the moon, even the scent of the wind, could determine whether sex would bring blessings or misfortune. One missed night might mean a failed crop, one forbidden embrace could anger a god. Nothing was spontaneous. Every touch had weight. Here's a bizarre footnote. Some scholars believe the principal wife underwent a monthly bloodletting ritual where small cuts were made on her tongue and earlobes to feed the gods in exchange for her continued fertility and influence. That's right. No quiet evenings with a glass of wine here. Just a bone awl and a bowl to catch what made you holy. You walk quietly now, passing under a low arch where the favourite's personal servants kneel beside a fire, grinding pigment for ceremonial face paint. They don't look up. Their hands are steady. Behind a reed screen a curtain flutters, and for just a second, you see her, the favourite, seated upright on a mat, her silhouette poised like a statue. She turns her head. Her gaze meets yours, not with surprise or fear, but with the kind of weary amusement only someone who knows every secret behind every door can give. She doesn't speak, she doesn't have to. You already understand, to be the emperor's favourite was to be the heart of the empire. Beating in rhythm with 1,000 silent expectations, you leave behind the heavy silence of the favourite's quarters and move into a new kind of buzz, a room where soft laughter hums beneath low conversation, where incense curls around words like vines, and the floors are slick with wear from generations of ceremonial feet. This is where alliances were forged not with swords but with bodies. Tonight, you're stepping into the intricate world of royal matchmaking where political negotiations often ended not with handshakes but with shared mats, sweet cacao and a bit of strategic nudity. Marriage among Aztec royalty wasn't just a family affair, it was warfare by other means. Every union was a campaign carefully drawn on maps, tallied in tribute and monitored for its long-term diplomatic value. The emperor and his advisors spent as much time arranging marriages as they did managing armies. Why conquer a rebellious province when you could marry its lord's daughter, make her bear your grandchild and bring the whole city state under your thumb with a smile and a baby blanket? But here's where things get truly fascinating and a little spicy. Many royal marriages were negotiated during week-long festivals, complete with gift exchanges, music, dances, and semi-public flirtation rituals. Imagine a gathering in the central palace courtyard, torches flickering against the murals of eagles and serpents, as young noblewomen paraded past a panel of elders, priests, and, of course, strategically seated eligible bachelors. This was less the bachelor and more the diplomatic Hunger Games. In one such ceremony known as the Ixiptla presentation, young noblewomen were adorned like goddesses, faces painted, bodies draped in feathers and shells, and presented to visiting nobles as living offerings. And while this might sound like a fashion show, the stakes were deadly serious. One wrong choice could doom an alliance. One successful pairing might end a war. If two rival rulers had been trading threats for years, sometimes the only thing to seal peace was a bed shared by their children. And make no mistake, the bride's consent wasn't exactly top priority. Royal women were expected to serve the state with their wombs. The more powerful the match, the more pressure she faced. Some were betrothed as toddlers, only meeting their husbands when they reached the acceptable childbearing age, usually around 14 or 15. By modern standards, yeah, extremely uncomfortable. But in the context of Aztec politics, youth was tied to purity, which in turn was tied to divine favour. A young bride meant fresh blood, fertile ground, and spiritual promise. Here's an odd little twist. During some of these arranged unions, the wedding night was partially overseen by a priestess or elder woman, not in a creepy voyeuristic way, hopefully, but as a ritual witness. She would ensure that the marriage was consummated according to tradition, sometimes even offering herbs to boost stamina or ease pain. The act itself wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. The two bodies becoming one represented the merging of city-states, gods, lineages, and futures. You weren't just lying with your spouse, you were uniting temples and armies. And then there were the post-marriage feasts. Oh, you'd think after such high-stakes pairings people would just go to bed and process the trauma. But nope. The next morning was all about showing off. Families threw massive banquets to flaunt their new in-laws. Dancers in turquoise masks, steaming pots of turkey and amaranth, chocolate poured from onyx vessels, it was all there. And the newlyweds were expected to appear, glowing and possibly exhausted, to be paraded like prize bulls. Still, beneath all that ceremonial grandeur, human emotions bubbled. Some matches genuinely worked out. Shared intellect, mutual respect, even love blooming in the shadows. Others turned bitter fast. One famous case whispers of a royal bride from Texcoco who refused to sleep with her new husband, a minor cousin of the emperor, because he smelled like old maize. Her defiance led to exile, but her story lived on in songs. She became a minor folk heroine of rebellious nobility. But what if you were a noblewoman with no say in your future, expected to marry a man you'd never met, and your true love was someone entirely forbidden, say a palace servant or even another woman? That's where things got risky. Court gossip could be weaponized. Servants were known to be bribed into silence or into betrayal. And one whisper in the wrong ear could lead to interrogation, public shame, or worse. Some young nobles tried to resist. There are half-hidden references in the codices to elopements, secret affairs and arranged marriages gone dramatically wrong. One tells of a daughter of a high-ranking priest who tried to flee with a musician on the eve of her wedding to a warlord's son. They made it 3 days before being caught. He was sacrificed. She was sent to serve in a temple until death, literally walled inside as a living vow. Her body was never found, but her tale still echoes through ballads sung by wandering performers. And then there's the open scholarly debate about just how much agency noblewomen really had in these unions. Some historians argue that they were powerless, traded like goods. Others believe there were quiet forms of resistance, coded language and embroidery, shared glances during ceremonies, calculated delays in rituals to buy time or shift fate. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Constrained? Yes, but not entirely voiceless. By now, you've followed enough of these ceremonial trails to realize that the bedroom wasn't just a place for private intimacy in the Aztec world. It was a battlefield in disguise. Every pillow was a peace treaty, every whispered name had consequences. Every pregnancy had the weight of dynasties behind it. And as you leave this part of the palace, passing under a frieze depicting the goddess Xochiquetzal being embraced by a masked god, you catch sight of something painted into the shadows. Two figures, unlabelled, ambiguous, standing close beneath a flowering tree. Are they lovers? Enemies? The start of a new alliance or the end of one? The answer, as with most things here, depends entirely on who's watching and who gets to tell the story. The palace air has shifted again, warmer now, heavier. You can almost taste the unease wafting down this narrow corridor. Gone are the bright gardens and feathered hangings. Instead, you walk past plain stone walls and tightly shut doors, each marked with tiny notches, like silent warnings. This is the realm of inspections. And tonight, you've stumbled into one of the strangest and most awkward rituals in Aztec noble life, the virginity inspection. Yes, you heard that right. For a society obsessed with sacred union and divine bloodlines, verifying a bride's purity wasn't just a concern, it was practically a state ceremony. And while the subject matter feels squirm-inducing, especially by modern standards, for Aztec royalty it was about legitimacy, fertility, and keeping ancestral lineage as immaculate as a codex page. Now, let's clarify something. Not every bride was inspected. Commoners, mostly left alone, minor nobles probably spared. But if you were marrying into the royal family, particularly into the emperor's circle, you could expect your body to be assessed like a diplomatic scroll. Before the wedding night, an elder midwife or temple priestess, often referred to as a Tlamatl-Quetzalcoatl, would perform the inspection. Her job? Determine whether the young woman's body had remained sealed in honour of the gods. You can stop cringing! No one enjoys talking about this, but for the Aztecs, this wasn't about prurience, it was law. A girl found to be dishonoured could lose her status, her dowry, and even her life. Worse, her family could be publicly shamed, accused of trying to deceive the imperial line, which means some households resorted to all kinds of bizarre tricks. There are whispered stories of young women being bled from elsewhere to mimic the expected signs, or of mothers bribing priestesses to look the other way. Morally shady? Absolutely. But in a world where purity was currency, people got creative. Here's a lesser-known fact. The inspection wasn't always done in private. In some elite cases, it was witnessed. That's right, midwives weren't alone. A priestess, a noblewoman, or even a court elder might stand by to confirm the results, depending on the marriage's political significance. Imagine that your most vulnerable moment transformed into a tiny, terrible tribunal, with your future riding on one person's word. But did it always go smoothly? Not even close. There's a famous account, half legend, half historical footnote, of a noble bride named Tenochtitlan who refused the inspection. Flat out refused. She was the daughter of a powerful ally from the eastern provinces, betrothed to a general in Moctezuma V's army or so. When the midwife came to her chamber with the ceremonial cloth and quiet prayers, Tenochtitlan reportedly stared her down and said, "The gods see me. That is enough." Bold move, revolutionary even. The court was scandalised. The general hesitated, but her father's influence was strong enough to override the traditionalists. The marriage went forward, the world didn't end. But Tenochtitlan's name never again appeared in court records. Some say she was quietly sidelined. Others say she became a secret spiritual advisor to later queens. The truth? Like so much in palace life, it vanished behind a reed curtain. Scholars are divided on how widespread these inspections really were. Some argue they were largely symbolic, rarely enforced and exaggerated by Spanish chroniclers looking to shock their European readers. Others maintain that they were regular and systematized, especially within the emperor's court. There's no definitive answer, which makes you wonder how many stories like Tenochtitlan's were erased, smoothed out by cautious scribes, or buried in the rubble when the Spanish levelled Tenochtitlan. But one thing's for sure, the pressure to appear untouched was immense, not just physically, but spiritually. Virginity in the Aztec world wasn't merely a lack of sexual experience, it was a sacred alignment, a sign that a young woman had preserved her divine energy, her tonali, for the correct partner and purpose. Losing it outside those bounds was seen as leaking power, wasting a blessing the gods had given. That belief extended to clothing too. Virgin brides wore specific garments, long white cloaks with minimal embroidery, bare feet, hair parted simply. After the wedding night, their entire aesthetic changed. More colour, more symbols of fertility. In some households, the ceremonial cloak was even kept as a relic, a sign of successful transition from maiden to matron. Think of it like a weirdly intense version of the wedding dress, but infused with spiritual charge. And then there's the strange little corner of the inspection tradition involving dreams. Some noble families claimed that prophetic dreams could reveal a daughter's true purity. If a mother dreamt of her daughter walking barefoot through rain without being touched by water, it meant she was untouched. A snake circling her meant temptation. A burning cornfield, that was bad. Don't ask how or why, dream logic is dream logic. But some families would delay or expedite the inspection depending on what someone saw in a vision. Let's also not forget the stakes for the men. If a groom claimed his bride had deceived him, if he said she hadn't bled or seemed practiced, he could demand a tribunal. And yes, there were actual investigations. The bride's parents might be called in, the midwife questioned, even the servants interrogated. Imagine that. Your wedding night becomes an imperial case file. It could go either way. Sometimes the bride was vindicated, sometimes not. If the accusation was false, the groom could be punished, though rarely with the same intensity. Double standards were alive and well. As you slip past the last inspection chamber, the air feels cooler. Not because the stone's any different, but because this part of the palace holds a peculiar tension, a legacy of shame, fear, and spiritual control all disguised as virtue. The young women who walked these halls weren't just daughters or brides, they were symbols of an empire's perfection, expected to embody ideals that no human could consistently uphold. And now, with the whispers fading and the torches guttering low, you realise something uncomfortable. This wasn't about sex, it was about power. Who could define purity? Who could enforce it? Who got to survive it? You're walking now through a narrower hall, where the walls are lined with delicately painted feathers, parrots, hummingbirds, even puck and quetzal plumes, all frozen mid-flight across faded murals. It's beautiful in that precise, slightly suffocating way, the kind of beauty meant to distract you from the sharpness underneath. And just ahead is a latticework door, its frame carved with intertwined serpents and vines. Push it open, and welcome to the emotional battlefield of royal harems, where every kiss could be a gambit and every whisper could end in blood. Let's be clear, the Aztecs didn't use the word harem, but functionally that's what this was. Dozens of wives and concubines, noble women, distant princesses, even captured elites, living within a controlled palace complex, each with her own chamber, servants and status. It was less an orgy of luxury and more a high-stakes, slow-burning game of social chess, complete with silent rivalries, coded gestures and emotional hostage-taking. Inside these walls, intimacy wasn't just personal, it was a form of leverage. Each woman hoped to win not just the emperor's heart, good luck with that, but his attention, his protection, and most importantly, his trust. A single evening spent in his chamber could result in a child, and a child meant potential elevation, a better room, a stronger position, perhaps even favour for her own family back home. And when that many people are competing for affection and political proximity in one gilded space, things get complicated. Start with the hierarchy. At the top, the Xihuacoatl, the principal wife you've already met, who functioned like a queen. Below her were the secondary wives, usually ranked by the prestige of their birth families. Beneath them were official concubines. And somewhere below even that, the unofficial ones, those whispered to be lovers of the emperor but never acknowledged publicly. The entire system was layered like a maize cake, except instead of sweetness, it was seasoned with passive aggression and quiet sabotage. It wasn't uncommon for alliances to form within the harem. One concubine might befriend another, usually from a non-rival city-state, and form a subtle alliance. They'd watch each other's children, share information about who the emperor had visited, or plot ways to get their sons invited to military training at an earlier age. It was soft diplomacy played out through shared meals and embroidered offerings. But those alliances could shift in a heartbeat. Jealousy flared like lightning. There are scattered records, mostly from Spanish accounts, but backed by indigenous oral traditions, of women poisoning rivals with nightshade hidden in tamales, or slipping insects into ceremonial clothes. And always, the weapon of choice was gossip. The wrong rumour at the right moment could ruin someone. She disrespected the goddess. She's sterile. She's been sending messages to a priest. All potentially career-ending, if not life-ending, accusations. What's strange, though, is how normal all of this was. Young noblewomen raised to become secondary wives were trained not just in etiquette and weaving, but in how to manage status. They were taught to read subtle signs, which gifts to give, which gods to pray to in front of which rivals, how to feign disinterest in someone else's rising favour. Emotional intelligence wasn't just useful, it was a survival skill, and the stakes were higher than bruised feelings. A slip in rank could mean exile, public shame, or worse, forced temple service. That's a polite way of saying you might be handed over to become a ritual figure, one step away from sacrifice. Still, amid all this manoeuvring, there were moments of tenderness. Women formed deep friendships, even love. In rare cases, lovers. The palace was its own universe, sealed off, cloistered, and strangely intimate. Long nights spent braiding each other's hair, singing lullabies, crying over children lost in illness or ritual. Behind all the scheming were real people, bonded by shared vulnerability and the exhausting performance of perfection. There's one quiet tale passed down in fragments about two concubines, both from enemy regions, who became lovers. They were careful, of course. Met in the steam baths, shared coded glyphs in flower arrangements, left small painted stones for each other under the hallway altars. When one was caught and executed for an unrelated crime, accused of interfering in a priestly selection, the other stopped speaking, for months. Eventually she was reassigned to a distant temple, and the garden where they used to meet was sealed. No official record names them, but some say the stones still show up in the gardens now and then, smooth, black, carved with a single blooming lily. Here's something else. The emperor himself rarely got involved in the politics of his own harem. He didn't have time, and frankly, he didn't need to. The system was self-regulating. The women policed each other far more efficiently than any court official ever could. His role was to appear when needed, father children, and occasionally grant favours. Some emperors, like Moctezuma II, were said to be generous to favoured consorts, giving them land or jewels. Others were distant, using the harem only for ritual and alliance building. Either way, the emotional labour of maintaining harmony fell entirely on the women within. There's an open scholarly debate about whether the harem was physically walled off. Some argue it functioned as a separate complex with restricted entry guarded by eunuch-like attendants or fiercely loyal female stewards. Others believe it was more fluid, chambers scattered across the palace but socially defined rather than physically enclosed. The truth might lie somewhere between invisible walls made of rules, expectations, and ever-present eyes. And about those attendants, they played a huge role, often functioning as confidants, informants, and enforcers. A loyal chambermaid could make or break a concubine's day, a treacherous one could end her life, which is why many women developed complex relationships with their staff. Bribes, shared secrets, even adopting their servants' children as their own for protection and loyalty. You step now into a central chamber, open to the sky, moonlight pouring down like cold milk onto an obsidian floor. There's a small pool, still and black, where women once bathed before major ceremonies. The air here is strangely quiet, like even time itself holds its breath. You imagine the echo of footsteps, hushed laughter, maybe even muffled sobs, and you realise this isn't just a story about who slept with whom. It's about how power trickled sideways, about how women, supposedly on the margins, actually shaped the pulse of the empire through pillow talk, rivalry and resilience. Every favour granted, every airborne, or every alliance confirmed with a quiet nod or a restless night. All of it passed through here, through the hands and hearts of women navigating a world that demanded they be beautiful, obedient, and brilliant, all at once. Down a darker hallway now, the stone feels colder under your feet, the torches burning lower, flickering like they're unsure whether to stay lit. You're not in the heart of the palace anymore. This is a quieter wing, more solemn, less perfumed, and cloaked in a strange, tense reverence. These are the private quarters of blood relatives, where the politics of Aztec royalty took a deeply controversial turn. Tonight, we're going to talk about something rarely mentioned out loud, even in hushed tones: the Forbidden Brothers, the inner circle of imperial incest. Let's get something out of the way early. Royal sibling marriage wasn't some bizarre perversion dreamt up in a historical fever dream. It was strategic. Practiced across ancient civilizations from Egypt to Inca Peru, sibling or close kin unions were considered the ultimate way to preserve divine bloodlines. The Aztecs, especially at the highest levels, weren't strangers to this idea. In fact, by the later stages of the empire, it became more common, necessary even, for the emperor to marry a half-sister or close cousin to ensure that his children were considered truly legitimate. Here's the rationale. The Aztec emperor wasn't just a king, he was a living extension of the gods, a symbolic anchor for the world. His bloodline was not only noble, it was believed to carry divine essence, directly connected to celestial origins like the legendary Toltecs. Letting that blood mix too freely with non-royal lines, that was risky. Diluting divine power could, in theory, weaken the empire. So what did they do? They kept it in the family, literally. Of course, these weren't love matches. Sibling marriages were arranged with all the warmth of a tax agreement. They were solemn, ceremonial, and above all political. The emperor's half-sister, often raised in the same palace but in a separate wing, would be groomed for this role from childhood. She was taught not only how to perform her duties as a wife and mother, but also how to embody the appropriate religious symbolism. Her union with her brother was seen not as taboo, but as a cosmic necessity, like two stars aligning in the night sky. That said, it still gave some people the ick, even back then. The broader noble class didn't universally approve of these unions, and plenty of political rivals used the practice as ammunition. Whispers in court, satirical poems passed hand to hand, even subtle jabs in court paintings. Yes, there were those who saw this for what it was, a way for emperors to hoard power behind locked family doors. And here's the uncomfortable fringe detail. Some of these incestuous unions were, at least initially, kept quiet. Official records might list the bride by name but omit her relation to the groom. Sometimes her public title would obscure the connection, daughter of the House of Aztlan or Lady of the Southern Wind. Not inaccurate, but definitely evasive. Later, when the marriage had produced heirs and political stability was assured, the family connection might be quietly acknowledged, even celebrated. See how your bloodline remains, a priest might say, while conveniently ignoring the eyebrow-raising logistics. So what was it actually like to grow up knowing your sibling might become your spouse? Well, the palace wasn't exactly a house with one big dinner table. Boys and girls, even those of similar age, were raised in different wings with different teachers and different life tracks. A young prince trained in statecraft, combat, and ritual bloodletting. A young princess learned sacred dances, calendrical chants, and how to be appropriately silent. When their paths finally crossed at festivals, ceremonies, or arranged meetings, it wasn't as siblings, but as living symbols of their respective dynasties. Still, not every union worked out. There's one case half buried in the Codex Mendoza and echoed in Nahuatl oral traditions, of a brother-sister pairing that ended in disaster. The emperor's daughter, Tenochtitlan, was forced to marry her elder half-brother, a high-ranking priest in training. According to the tale, she despised him, said he smelled of stone and blood and refused to consummate the marriage. The scandal erupted when she was found trying to escape the palace disguised as a servant. Her punishment? Exile to a temple of Tlazolteotl, goddess of purification, where she spent the rest of her life weaving ceremonial cloth. Her brother? Quietly reassigned to a less visible religious post. The entire affair was wiped from official records, mostly, which brings us to the open scholarly debate. Was sibling marriage in Aztec royalty widespread or rare? Some anthropologists argue it was only practiced in the final decades before Spanish conquest, when pressure to reinforce legitimacy was at its peak. Others point to linguistic cues in marriage records and ritual art that suggest the practice was more normalized than previously assumed. There's no consensus, largely because the records are deliberately unclear, scrubbed by time and colonial interference. And how did these relationships function on a personal level? That's the mystery. Were they affectionate, cold, strictly ceremonial? We have no first-hand letters, no journal entries. All we have are the side effects. Alliances held together by strange loyalty, children with unusually elevated religious roles, and the uncanny frequency with which the emperor's favourite wife also just happened to be his closest kin. There's another layer here too. Incestuous unions weren't only about keeping bloodlines clean, they were about keeping secrets close. Who better to trust with delicate political knowledge than someone who shares your ancestry and your ambition? A sibling wife was less likely to betray you to a rival faction, more likely to protect your legacy, and possibly, though not always, better at anticipating your next move. Creepy? A little. Clever? Absolutely. And now, as you stand in one of these private family quarters, Bare stone walls, a carved bench, a small altar to the goddess Coatlicue, you feel the cold weight of all that legacy. These were rooms where family love and imperial duty blurred until they were indistinguishable. Where sisters were expected to become mothers, wives and mythicsome symbols, all before their voices even cracked from childhood. It's hard not to wonder how many looked at their future and thought, is this sacred? Or is this survival wrapped in ceremony? You leave the chamber quietly, the echo of your steps drowned beneath the layers of centuries-old secrets. This empire, so grand and intricate, demanded everything from its royalty, even the reshaping of human instincts to fit the sharp corners of divine ambition. The hallway grows darker, but not from lack of light. Something about the atmosphere shifts, thicker, electric, like the air just before a storm. You pass a row of carvings, and this time the imagery is unmistakable. Intertwined bodies, blooming flowers, writhing serpents, and beneath them, blades. This is where you stop walking. You've arrived at the crossroads of life, death, and desire. Tonight, you're stepping into the place where sex and sacrifice meet face to face, where fertility rituals were not just symbolic, but sometimes brutally, violently real. It's easy to romanticize ancient ritual as colourful performance with feathers and incense and ceremonial dances. And yes, the Aztecs did all that. But woven into those performances were moments that made everyone watching hold their breath, not just from awe, but from fear. Because for the Aztecs, the boundary between pleasure and offering wasn't a line, it was a circle. What gave life could also be demanded in return. Let's start with the agricultural calendar. For a society so deeply tied to the cycles of corn, rain and sun, fertility wasn't just about human reproduction, it was the engine of survival. If the rains failed or the harvest came up short, people starved. Entire cities could unravel. And who did the empire turn to in these moments? Not just the priests, but the wombs of noble women, the bodies of chosen consorts, and sometimes those willing to play the role of divine lovers in the ultimate sacrifice. Here's where it gets very real. In some high-level fertility rituals, a young man would be selected to impersonate a god, usually Totec or Tezcatlipoca depending on the season. He was fed, honoured, dressed in fine clothes, given women to sleep with, and treated like a deity for weeks, sometimes months. Sounds dreamy, right? Until the festival climax, when he was sacrificed. Not just killed, ceremonially stripped of skin or heart to return his essence to the gods. His pleasure was not indulgence, it was part of the offering. And the women chosen to lie with him, they weren't just lovers, they were priestesses, noble daughters, or specially selected temple women trained to serve in this role. Sometimes one, sometimes several. Their union was meant to imitate divine procreation, the reawakening of the earth after drought, the fertility of crops, the balance between masculine and feminine forces, but it wasn't always just symbolic. Witnesses describe these rites as intense, overwhelming, and in some cases, deeply troubling, because while sex was performed in the name of cosmic order, the participants knew how it would end. One woman, sometimes referred to in oral legend as Yautzin, is said to have fallen in love with the god impersonator she was paired with. According to the story, she tried to run with him into the forest the night before the sacrifice. They were caught. She wasn't killed, but she was tattooed, marked as unclean for breaking sacred trust. She spent the rest of her life serving in the Temazcal baths, caring for others, but never again allowed to participate in ritual. Her name survives not in the codices, but in lullabies, where she's described as the woman who held the sun too tightly. And here's the fringe fact that rarely gets mentioned. There were ceremonies involving sexual acts between masked priests and symbolic brides during spring planting festivals. These acts were believed to awaken the soil, reenacting mythic unions of the gods. Some were metaphorical, some not so much. And while these rites were usually confined to high temple spaces, they weren't exactly secret. Everyone knew they happened. They were whispered about, gossiped over, and sometimes reenacted in more innocent forms in village dances. The divine union was everywhere, and everyone knew what it really meant. Of course, not every sexual sacrificial ritual involved men impersonating gods. Women too were offered as divine representations, especially to Tlaloc the rain god, or to Xochiquetzal, the goddess of beauty and fertility. Girls chosen for these roles were typically young, noble, and, this part is especially dark, expected to remain pure until their final night. Their last act in some festivals was to sleep with a priest or symbolic consort before being led up the temple steps. Whether that act was consensual or ritualized coercion is a point of scholarly debate. Some accounts claim the participants were honored and willing. Others suggest something closer to silent compliance born of cultural duty and religious fear. Even more unsettling is how these acts were rationalized. The Aztecs believed the universe was a fragile machine fueled by blood and desire. The gods had created humans through acts of sacrifice and copulation, both violent, both sacred. To keep the balance, humans had to return the favour. It wasn't cruelty for its own sake, it was cosmic maintenance. They didn't want to kill, they had to. Or so they believed. That belief ran so deep that even some Spanish priests, after witnessing the scale and fervour of these rites, admitted in their writings that the Aztecs gave themselves over to death as to a lover. That's haunting, yes, but also revealing. Because this wasn't about madness. It was devotion, stretched to its furthest, to its sharpest edge. Some modern scholars argue that not all sexual rites ended in death, that some of the darker stories were exaggerations, either by colonial writers or later interpreters, eager to frame the Aztecs as monstrous. And that's fair. There's definitely bias in how these accounts have been passed down. But even if a fraction of the stories are true, the implications are enormous. Sex was not just pleasure, or even just politics. It was the stage on which the fate of entire cities was played out. And now you find yourself standing at the base of a wide stone staircase. The temple rises above you, its steps stained not with metaphor but with centuries of ritual. You can almost hear the flutes above, soft and dissonant, the heartbeat rhythm of a Tenochtitlan drum calling the city to witness. It's late spring, the fields are hungry, the gods must be and somewhere up there, behind the torchlight and flower-strewn altars, two bodies meet, not in lust, but in something older and more terrifying, a sacred moment with no happy ending. Because in the Aztec world, fertility was not gifted, it was paid for, in blood, in breath, in bodies given willingly, or not. The wind is different up here, cooler, thinner, edged with distant drumming that pulses like a second heartbeat. You're no longer in the Emperor's chambers or the women's quarters. You've climbed higher, beyond the domestic reaches of the palace, into the sacred terraces where only the select few are allowed to tread. Here, under the sharp gaze of the stars, the rituals take on a stranger form. Because now you're about to witness the night of the jaguar priests, where sex, sacrifice and shapeshifting meet in the shadows of the obsidian gods. Let's set the stage. The Aztecs believed that during certain calendar nights, especially those aligned with eclipses, solstices, or the passage of the fire serpent in the sky, the veil between worlds thinned. On these rare nights, priests known as ocelopili or jaguar priests donned the skins of jaguars and ocelots, covering their faces with snarling masks, their bodies painted in moon-white chalk and sacred ochre. These weren't just costumes, they were transformations. The priests weren't playing animals, they were becoming them. And that transformation came with rituals that blurred the lines between violent ecstasy and divine possession. In the most secretive of these rites, held atop temple rooftops or deep within underground shrines, jaguar priests would engage in ceremonial unions with selected partners. Not always women, sometimes men, sometimes both. The gender of the partner didn't matter. What mattered was the offering of energy, the raw, burning life force called Tenali. The idea was simple, in a terrifying sort of way. The gods had given life through a union of opposites. To channel their power, humans had to reenact that primal fusion. The chosen partners weren't just random consorts either. They were called discipla, living stand-ins for gods or divine concepts. Sometimes they were young temple initiates, trained from childhood. Other times they were nobles selected for their beauty, bloodline, or simply their willingness to surrender. Not everyone volunteered. Not everyone had a choice. One whispered tale, still told in some Nahuatl communities in a much softer, sanitized version, tells of a young warrior named Ehecatl, chosen to serve as an Eclipses for Tezcatlipoca during the last eclipse before harvest season. He was bathed in sacred water, anointed with oil and dressed in gold and black. That night he was led to a chamber lit by obsidian mirrors and fireflies. There 4 jaguar priests circled him in silence. What happened next isn't written in the codices, but the next day Ehecatl walked through the city naked, except for ash and feathers. Weeping and laughing at once, his mind never returned. Some say he glimpsed the gods, others say he lost himself to them. Here's a strange historical wrinkle. Spanish chroniclers were obsessed with these rites, but deeply confused by them. They tried to interpret the jaguar ceremonies as devil worship, orgies, or even madness. But what they missed was the core truth. These weren't acts of indulgence. They were terrifying forms of sacrifice. Giving your body to a god wasn't always about being cut open on a stone slab. Sometimes it meant surrendering your mind, your identity, your will, and doing it while others watched. Yes, these ceremonies were often witnessed. Not by crowds, but by a select group of elders, priestesses, and temple attendants who served as ritual anchors. Their job was to keep the ceremony grounded, to monitor the transitions, to ensure that the priest returned from his transformation intact. Sometimes he did. Sometimes he didn't. And now, for a truly bizarre footnote, hallucinogens were a big part of these rites. Mushrooms, morning glory seeds, and peyote were commonly used, not just by the jaguar priests but also their partners. The goal was to slip into what scholars now call a ritual trance state. Within that altered consciousness, the boundaries between self and other, between man and God, dissolved. You weren't making love to a priest anymore, you were becoming a vessel, a bridge between earth and sky. The act itself became a living prayer. This is where it gets complicated. There's ongoing debate among scholars about the exact nature of these rituals. Some argue they were symbolic, more dance than literal union. Others insist on the physicality, citing oral histories and post-conquest testimonies as evidence of actual sexual rites performed under divine sanction. What everyone agrees on is the intensity. Whatever happened during the night of the jaguar priests, it left scars, emotional, spiritual, and sometimes physical. Take the story of Citlali, a noblewoman from the coastal city of Tenochtitlan. She was chosen to be the Earth Bride during a new moon ceremony, meaning she would lie with a jaguar priest as the embodiment of the fertile land receiving divine rain. It sounds poetic until you read the rest. After the ritual, she was never seen in court again. One servant claimed she had been emptied out. Another said she glowed like the moon for 3 days, then disappeared. Whether she died, went mad, or chose exile, no one knows. But her family's name was later erased from the tribute rolls. A soft, bureaucratic execution. And then there's the most uncomfortable truth of all. These rituals weren't seen as dark or twisted in their time. They were revered. People wept to be chosen. Families saw it as the highest honour. Being touched by a god through the body of a man or woman was a divine gift, even if it destroyed you. To suffer ecstasy for the gods was to bring rain, crops, children, life. And in a world as fragile and volatile as theirs, that was worth the risk. You now find yourself in a circular stone room open to the sky. The floor is warm. Burned herbs linger in the cracks. You can almost see the jaguar skins folded near the altar, the mask resting on a bed of flowers, still damp from breath. And just for a moment, you feel what they must have felt. The dread, the awe, the sharp thrill of crossing over into the unknown. It's not sex, not exactly. It's surrender. A cosmic offering disguised as pleasure. A sacred union with no safe word. In this place, love isn't gentle. It prowls. It devours. And it leaves you not quite human when it's done. You're back in the inner court now, where the walls are golden with midday light and the tension has a different flavour. Less sacred, more simmering. The incense is lighter here, and the laughter you hear sounds almost normal. But don't be fooled, you're still in royal territory, and nothing that happens behind these embroidered curtains is ever simple. Tonight we're slipping into the softer shadows of scandal, following the quiet steps of noble women who, tired of playing the empire's dutiful daughters and obedient wives, decided to take their pleasures into their own hands. Because while the emperor may have had dozens of wives, the women themselves, they had needs, and sometimes they found ways to meet those needs with lovers of their own. Now, officially, Aztec noble women were expected to be the embodiment of modesty. Their clothing, high-necked tunics, their hair, bound tightly, their public demeanour, silent, reserved, with eyes lowered and hands folded. They were the symbols of order, patience, and divine femininity. But behind closed doors, human beings. Beautiful, brilliant, bored human beings. And boredom, as you've probably guessed, is an excellent catalyst for chaos. Affairs among noble women were rare, but not unheard of. In fact, they are buried deep in both oral traditions and the margins of surviving colonial texts. These weren't wild dalliances, no moonlit escapes or dramatic confessions. These were calculated, quiet rebellions, the kind born from years of being watched, judged, and shuffled around like game pieces. Let's talk about the logistics. How does a noble woman in a palace guarded by priests and stone-faced stewards manage to sneak in a lover? The answer: carefully, with a bit of bribery, and usually with the help of a servant who knew how to keep secrets, or at least who had something to lose if she didn't. Many of these affairs involved men of lower status. Palace gardeners, scribes, dancers, musicians, men who came and went quietly, knew how to blend into the background, and who often owed their jobs to the women they served. The relationships weren't always romantic. Sometimes they were transactional, sometimes playful, and sometimes, yes, genuinely affectionate, even loving, but always, always dangerous. There's one particularly juicy tale from Tlacopan, whispered through centuries, about a noble woman named Isil. She was said to be breathtaking, tall, with hair so black it shimmered blue in the sun. Married off at 16 to a distant cousin of the emperor, she spent her days overseeing textiles and ceremonial duties, but at night, she reportedly took lovers. Not one, not two, but a rotation. Her favourite was a young flute player who composed songs for her, each melody coded, disguised as temple hymns. Eventually a rival wife caught on and reported her to the priesthood. Izel didn't beg. She didn't deny, she simply asked to speak to the emperor. What happened next is a mystery. Some say she confessed everything and was sentenced to temple exile. Others claim she was so beloved, so politically useful, that the charges disappeared, and the flute player was sent on a long campaign and never seen again. But her story lived on. To this day, some lullabies are still called Izel songs, soft, mournful melodies that mean more than they say. The punishment for adultery was no joke. For commoners, it could mean death, stoning, strangling, or public execution. For nobles, slightly more complicated. If a noble woman was caught cheating, and her affair couldn't be covered up or blamed on sorcery, yes, that was an actual defence, she could be shamed, exiled, or even sacrificed. And not in a gentle way. One method involved stripping the offender of her rank and dressing her in rags for a ceremonial walk of shame through the city before sentencing. Very theatrical, very final. But here's the twist. Men caught in these affairs didn't always suffer the same fate. A gardener caught sleeping with a royal concubine might be executed, but a poet or court musician, sometimes they were simply banished or quietly reassigned. That double standard ran deep, rooted in the empire's need to control noble women's wombs. Because a child from an illicit union wasn't just scandalous, it was a threat to dynastic purity. The whole bloodline system could collapse over one unexpected pregnancy. And yet, despite the risks, these women still took lovers. Which tells you something. That hunger for freedom, for agency, for touch not dictated by the stars or the state, it burned brighter than fear. Some women went even further. There are hints, tiny, barely legible footnotes in the post-conquest records of relationships between noble women themselves. Romantic? Maybe. Sexual? Possibly, but definitely intimate. These bonds often formed during their training years in the Kalmakak schools, where girls were raised together from early childhood, taught songs, prayers, and etiquette. In that cloistered, emotionally charged environment, deep attachments blossomed. One story, recorded anonymously and never fully verified, tells of two young women, both betrothed to powerful men, who exchanged rings beneath the moon during a lunar eclipse. They vowed to remain loyal even after marriage, and continued their relationship for years through coded letters and nighttime visits arranged through a shared nurse mahad. When one of them died in childbirth, the other commissioned a temple carving in her honour, described only as an offering for a lost sister. The imagery, two blooming flowers twined around a single serpent. Make of that what you will. And then there were the calculated affairs. Not for love, not for rebellion, but for leverage. A woman might offer herself to a visiting noble to gain information, or ally with a younger courtier poised for promotion. These weren't flings, they were strategies. Sex, here, wasn't just about desire, it was currency, and some women raised to understand power but denied direct access to it found their own channels. Scholars today argue about how widespread these private rebellions really were. Some say they were the exception, rare and dramatic, and others suggest the palace buzzed with more quiet disobedience than we'll ever know. After all, history is written by the victors, and often by the men. The stories of these women survive not in official records, but in lullabies, embroidery patterns, and the way certain flowers were placed in funerary offerings, signals passed through generations. As you walk now through the sun-drenched hallway, past chambers echoing with the laughter of long-gone women, you feel it. 1,000 silent choices, 100 stolen nights, a palace shaped not just by emperors and warriors, but by restless hearts with too little freedom and too much intelligence to stay idle. Because even in an empire obsessed with order, some desires simply refuse to kneel. You head now toward one of the palace's most tightly controlled spaces, quiet, windowless, and suspiciously clean. No incense smoke drifts through here. No music, just the muffled sound of sandals on smooth stone, the hum of whispered orders, and that strange stillness that always seems to hang around people who aren't allowed to want anything. Welcome to the shadows of the court, where you'll meet the eunuchs and the servants known in Nahuatl as the Lakamer, or keepers of the house. But no one says their real title out loud. Everyone just calls them the Court of Whispers. Now, let's set the record straight. Officially, the Aztec Empire didn't practice widespread castration like some other ancient civilizations. There wasn't a state-sponsored system of creating eunuchs a la Byzantine or Chinese courts. But what did exist was something murkier. Men who were either asexual by nature, considered spiritually neutral, or who were rumoured to have been physically altered in some way. Accidents, punishments, or quiet, unspeakable procedures performed in the dark corners of power. Whatever the origin, these men served a very specific purpose: to guard and watch over the women of the palace. The logic was twisted but simple. You needed men to protect the harem, but you couldn't trust regular men near dozens of politically sensitive, emotionally frustrated, and often very bored noblewomen. The solution? Choose men who were, by reputation or condition, believed to pose no threat. Some were effeminate, some were celibate, some were men whose desires didn't fit neatly into the imperial mould. Others, no one ever asked. Or if they did, they didn't ask twice. And let's not sugarcoat it, these servants saw everything. They were the ones delivering messages, fetching ceremonial garments, pouring wine, adjusting perfume ratios, and quietly changing bloody sheets after the imperial wedding night. They knew which concubine had the emperor's favour, which one was plotting against the favourite, which noble daughter cried herself to sleep. They were walking ledgers of palace secrets, and yet they rarely spoke above a whisper, because their lives depended on silence. Here's where it gets weird. Despite their status as low-ranking servants, these men were sometimes feared, not because of physical strength, but because they were so deeply embedded into the intimate machinery of court life. They saw things others weren't supposed to see. They heard the Empress mutter in her sleep. They knew which high priest snuck into whose chamber after dark. And while they weren't allowed to speak these truths, the knowledge gave them power. Soft power. Dangerous power. There's a famous case, half legend, half political cautionary tale, of a palace servant named Akamapichtli, not to be confused with the emperor of the same name, who served as a dresser to the emperor's fourth wife. Rumour has it he kept a detailed set of glyphs hidden in his chamber, symbols representing every romantic entanglement, political betrayal, and unsanctioned tryst he witnessed over 20 years. When he was dismissed for unknown reasons, the emperor's court was said to fall into chaos for weeks. People were afraid of what he might reveal, of what he might fabricate. His name disappeared from all official records shortly after. No one knows if he was silenced or simply vanished with his secrets into the forest, but his legend lived on. Servants started referring to particularly juicy gossip as an Akamapichtli whisper. Now here's the quirky fringe fact. Some of these court watchers were also considered spiritually sacred. There are hints in the codices that men who lived without desire were seen as between worlds, not bound to the same cosmic roles as warriors or fathers. A few were even trained in ritual arts, especially those dealing with purification, prophecy, or dream interpretation. You can imagine the scene, a quiet man in simple white robes, neither priest nor peasant, sitting cross-legged while a noblewoman whispered her nightmares to him by candlelight, and he'd just nod, offering her a bowl of cacao and a flower whose name had been forgotten even then. That spiritual ambiguity, part servant, part seer, made them perfect confidants, and more than one noblewoman probably shared things with these men she wouldn't have dared tell her own husband. Whether out of trust, loneliness, or desperation, the bond that formed between a court woman and her whispering attendant could become something unique, something dangerous. And yes, sometimes those relationships crossed lines. There are scattered mentions in colonial texts of effeminate men of the palace who became entangled in scandals involving noble women. The language is vague. Terms like inappropriate familiarity or disrupted purity are used, which probably meant one of two things. They were caught in physical intimacy or knew too much and got too close. In either case, the consequences were rarely gentle: quiet execution, disfigurement, or being handed off to the priesthood for cleansing. The Aztecs didn't like ambiguity when it came to their sacred power structures. Scholars still debate whether these men were truly eunuchs in the surgical sense, or simply labelled as such for political convenience. Some believe it was more about behaviour. If a man appeared disinterested in women, or uninterested in fathering children, he was conveniently labelled safe. Others argue that under the weight of palace gossip, the line between reality and reputation didn't really matter. If people believed you were incapable of desire, you became invisible. And invisibility is a strange kind of power. You find yourself now in a long stone corridor lined with empty rooms, small chambers where these men once slept, dreamt, prayed and waited. There's a bowl on one cot, a comb, a folded cloth that might have once belonged to someone much higher ranked, and on the wall, a glyph etched into the plaster, crudely but carefully. It shows a man with no face standing between two jaguars, neither attacking, just watching. You stand in that silence and realise the most shocking truths of the palace didn't just unfold in the royal bedchambers. Sometimes they were carried in the hands of servants, never spoken aloud, kept safe behind a mouth that didn't dare move, but always listening. Because in a place where everyone's power was on display, the most dangerous person was the one who knew how to disappear. Now the scent changes again, pungent, earthy and sweet in a way that sits oddly in your throat. You're entering the twilight world of visions now, where the gods speak not in words but in colours, symbols, and the slow unravelling of your sense of reality. This is not a place of strategy or ceremony. This is the cave behind the cave, the part of Aztec royal life where sex wasn't just ritual, it was a doorway. Tonight, we walk into the realm of peyote, passion, and prophecy. For the Aztec elite, altered states weren't just entertainment. They were sacred tools as necessary as obsidian blades or feathered fans. Hallucinogenic plants, peyote, morning glory seeds, mushrooms, called teonanacatl, or flesh of the gods, were used in temples, healing rites, and yes, even royal bedchambers. Especially during rites meant to bond the soul to the divine through erotic energy. You might assume this was all done in some shadowy corner of a temple, but no, some of these ceremonies were held right inside the royal palace, often in secluded chambers painted entirely in black and gold. The emperor or high-ranking nobles would drink cacao, laced with ground peyote, then lie on mats surrounded by musicians playing haunting, repetitive melodies. Nearby, a consort or a priestess trained in sensual rituals would begin the awakening process. The goal? Not orgasm, not even pleasure, but divine contact. This wasn't about losing yourself, it was about finding the deeper version of yourself, the one you could only see when the veil of the physical world was burned away by heat and sacred chemistry. In these altered states, sex became something else entirely. Not an act, but a medium. Like paint, like stone, a way of sculpting something invisible. And who were the participants in these rituals? It varied. Sometimes, it was a noble couple attempting to conceive during an astrologically aligned window, neeking favour from Tlaloc, Quetzalcoatl, or even Xochipilli, the god of flowers, pleasure, art and same-sex love. Other times, it was a political bonding between two allied families, sealed through the sacred union of their representatives under the influence of vision-inducing substances. Occasionally, it was simply a noble seeking clarity, guided by a temple attendant whose body was both map and compass. One recorded instance describes a festival night where the emperor, facing a military crisis, fasted for 3 days, then entered a ceremonial union with a high priestess while under the effects of alaliuqui, the ground seeds of the morning glory flower. He claimed afterward to have seen the goddess Coyolxauhqui rise from his lover's mouth, deliver him a prophecy, and vanish into a snake made of stars. The following week, he changed the entire war strategy. It worked. His enemies surrendered. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe the gods really do have opinions about military logistics. Here's the fringe fact that turns everything sideways. In some of these rituals, the lines between reality and dream didn't end when the peyote wore off. Participants often reported weeks of altered perception, hearing the gods speak through servants' voices, feeling echoes of the union in sunlight, wind, even food. Some believed they had merged permanently with the divine and lived out the rest of their lives as semi-revered mystics. Others didn't handle it quite so well. There are records of nobles who never returned to normal, wandering the palace in ceremonial garb, speaking only in riddles, or weeping at the sight of feathers. And yes, not everyone believed in these practices. Some priests argued that the visions were indulgent, misleading, or dangerous, that the gods didn't want intimacy, only discipline. Others insisted these unions were essential, that without them the empire would grow spiritually sterile. The debate created quiet schisms within the religious elite, one side devoted to ecstasy and flowery release, the other to bloodletting and control. Scholars today argue over the frequency and nature of these rituals. Some believe they were rare, limited to only the most important moments. Others suggest a thriving subculture of dream-based erotic mysticism, particularly within the high priesthood and imperial court. The truth likely depends on which city-state you were standing in and which god was in favour that decade. But there's no debate about Xochipilli. The Prince of Flowers was beloved across the empire, depicted as a young, beautiful man seated in bliss, surrounded by blossoms, songbirds, and abstract patterns thought to represent the effects of hallucinogens. He was a god of pleasure, but also of sacred pleasure. Art, dance, sexuality. These were not distractions, they were gifts. And through them one could hear the divine more clearly. In his honour, certain noble couples would undergo vision fasting, a kind of sensual retreat where food, sex, and mind-altering substances were carefully regulated to bring about prophetic dreams. Participants sometimes emerged days later with visions of future children, warnings about political dangers, or even instructions for building new temples. It was less a honeymoon and more a cosmic brainstorm session. Of course, there were boundaries. Not just anyone could try this. To misuse sacred union was to risk madness or, worse, divine punishment. There's one tale of a nobleman who attempted to stage a private ceremony without priestly guidance. He took peyote, invited his concubine, and enacted what he believed was a proper ritual. By dawn he was found running naked through the city, screaming that the goddess Tlazolteotl had eaten his name. Whether that was divine retribution or a bad trip, no one wanted to find out. His house was burned. His name was erased from the tribute rolls. The concubine was reassigned to a mountain shrine. End of story. You're standing now in one of the vision rooms. The walls are black, the ceiling low, and the smell of dried flowers lingers under the sharp tang of mineral smoke. There's a mat still rolled in the corner, a bowl of hardened cacao paste, and on the wall, a painted glyph of two hearts touching at their tips, surrounded by a field of spiralling lines. This was not a place of shame, not a place of sin. It was a launch pad, equal parts bed, altar, and telescope. Here, lovers didn't just embrace, they dissolved into meaning, whispered questions into the stars and hoped something whispered back. Because in the royal chambers of the Aztec Empire, even passion could become prophecy. You're back in the palace again, but this time the mood is different. There's no soft hum of flutes, no scent of copal trailing through the halls. Instead, the air feels charged, like it's waiting for something or someone to break. And here, painted above a doorway in red and black, you see it, a series of spirals leading to an outstretched hand, and on that hand, a single symbol etched in dark ink. It's not just decoration, it's a warning. Tonight you're stepping into the realm of shame tattoos, an ancient, permanent form of justice etched directly onto the skin of those who crossed the lines of sexual law. In the Aztec world, shame wasn't just felt, it was displayed. Most societies have had some version of public punishment for sexual crimes. Stoning, flogging, exile. The Aztecs had those too, but in certain cases, particularly for noblemen and noble women who couldn't be publicly executed due to their family's importance, a different form of justice was employed. Tattooing. Not the beautiful, sacred kind. This wasn't about honouring the gods, this was branding. Social scarlet lettering. And it wasn't subtle. Let's start with what it meant. Getting caught in an act of adultery, especially by someone of lower or higher rank, was one of the worst transgressions you could commit. And if the offence couldn't be cleaned away through marriage, bribery, or the sacrifice of one party, the skin was chosen as the canvas of atonement. The tattoos varied by region, but common designs included a blackened tongue, symbolising lies, twisted serpents for betrayal, or a half-open flower, once beautiful, now wilted and shamed. And these tattoos weren't given in quiet rooms. No, they were part of public spectacle. A tribunal would be held, witnesses summoned, and if guilt was confirmed, the guilty would be stripped to the waist. A priest or tattoo specialist, sometimes even a member of the victim's family, would ink the skin using obsidian needles and dye made from ash, blood, and crushed insects. The pain wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. The stain was meant to last a lifetime. You might wonder, why not just execute them? Why not behead the cheaters and be done with it? Simple. Sometimes they were too useful. In a court filled with shifting alliances, you didn't always want your enemies dead. You wanted them weakened, and nothing weakened a courtier, a scribe, or a noblewoman more effectively than branding them as impure, stripped them of credibility, made them a punchline in palace gossip, and ensured they'd never rise too far again. Imagine trying to negotiate a land deal while the person across from you is distracted by the snake crawling up your neck. Women received these marks too, especially those involved in affairs that threatened political alliances. If you were a concubine caught sleeping with someone outside the palace, expect a tattoo across the lower back or in a wrist, places that couldn't be hidden during rituals. One common design for women was a crushed butterfly, once a symbol of transformation and beauty, now a mark of wasted potential. And these weren't just punishments, they were lessons. The mark served as public reminders to everyone else in the palace. Desire is dangerous, and if you indulge it without permission, without protocol, it will follow you. Not just in whispers, but in the way your skin pulls every time you reach for your cloak. Of course, not everyone accepted this quietly. There's a story, half fact, half palace myth, about a scribe named Tenoch, who fell in love with a married noblewoman. They met in secret for months, leaving notes hidden inside hollowed quills and etched into dried flower petals. When they were finally caught, thanks to a jealous rival, the tribunal offered them two options: death or the ink. The woman chose the tattoo, but Tenoch refused. He demanded that if his love was considered a crime, he'd rather burn than be marked. So they burned him, ritually, with controlled fire, so his death would be as clean as it was final. The woman lived. Her tattoo? A broken sun across her shoulder blade. She never married again. But according to the gossip, she never stopped writing poetry either. Some of those poems, whispered between the lines, are still recited by singers today, little traces of rebellion, hidden in the cadence of flowers and fire. Here's a stranger twist. In some fringe cases, shame tattoos actually backfired. A branded noble who managed to survive politically, usually with enough family muscle or money, could turn the mark into a kind of twisted mystique. Yes, I have a serpent on my chest, one former courtier reportedly said. That just means I'm honest about who I am. He became a cult favourite, invited to private salons, known for giving relationship advice of all things. That's some elite-level spin, but most weren't so lucky. Once marked, a person's social trajectory was basically ruined. Marriages were harder to arrange, invitations slowed to a trickle, some retreated from public life entirely, living in quiet exile while the city moved on. Others embraced the darkness, becoming low-level spies, seduction bait in political schemes, or worse, pulled into the orbit of Tlazolteotl, goddess of filth and purification, who we'll revisit soon. Some even claimed that their tattoo gave them a kind of spiritual immunity. I have nothing left to hide, one woman reportedly said, smiling as she walked barefoot into a sacred bath. And yes, there's scholarly debate here. Some historians argue that these tattoo punishments were exaggerated by colonial chroniclers trying to paint Aztec justice as barbaric. Others suggest the practice was underreported, that skin-based punishment was common, even among non-nobles, and was simply erased by families who didn't want the stigma remembered. The truth? Probably somewhere in the middle. Enough stories survive to suggest that something like this did happen. Whether it was rare spectacle or routine correction remains clouded in ash and ink. You step now into a small courtyard behind the tribunal hall. The sun is low, and the stones still radiate warmth. There's a bench here, worn smooth from use, and carved into the wall behind it, barely visible, a spiral leading into a serpent. Not stylized, just direct. marked like someone was tired of pretending, because in the end, that's what shame tattoos were. Not just punishment, but branding a forced narrative, a declaration, this is who you are now, forever. But even in a world as rigid as the Aztec elite, people sometimes found ways to reclaim their stories, to tattoo meaning back into their skin. The sun is higher now, casting sharp angles across the palace stone. The hum of daytime activity swells all around, servants weaving between courtyards, priestesses gathering for chants, and somewhere in the distance the thrum of drums tuning up for an afternoon ceremony. It's here, in the calm between rituals, that the young nobles begin their lessons. No, not swordplay or politics, not today. Today the lesson is sex, Aztec style. Welcome to the educational awkwardness of the Calmacac and Tenochtitlan, where noble youth were trained not just for war and governance, but for managing the more carnal responsibilities of empire. Let's start with the basics. The Aztec Empire was remarkably structured when it came to education. Boys and girls from noble families were sent to different schools depending on their social role. Future priests, warriors, or administrators went to the Calmacac, a rigorous religious and academic institution. Commoners and military hopefuls were educated in the Tenochtitlan, which was more physical, think less divine geometry and more how to kill with a spear. But in both, one thing was clear. The body wasn't just a vessel, it was a tool, a weapon, and yes, a future offering. And when it came to sex, the tone was complicated. The Aztecs didn't talk about sex as something to avoid, they talked about it as something to control. From a young age, students, especially those of noble birth, were warned of the dangers of excess. Passion could weaken your tonality, your life force, cloud your mind, make you a fool. There are surviving admonitions that read like anxious mum blogs. Do not laugh too much, do not lie with women, do not eat too many chili peppers. Apparently overseasoned food and lust were considered equally slippery slopes. But despite all the warnings, sex education was baked into the curriculum. Just not the way you'd think. There were no diagrams, no awkward scrolls passed around behind the schoolhouse. It was oral tradition, priests and elders telling allegorical stories about gods who lost battles because of desire, or couples who pleased the gods through disciplined union. Metaphors were everywhere. Want to talk about lust? Use a tale about maize going soft in the rain. Need to explain ejaculation? Refer to the moon dripping silver into the lake. Subtle? Barely. But surprisingly poetic. And while the emphasis was on restraint, students were taught about function too. How to behave on a wedding night, what body fluids were considered sacred, the proper times of the month to engage in union without offending Tlaloc or upsetting the balance of Venus. Yes, even the gods had preferences. Some nights were auspicious, others not so much. If you accidentally consummated your marriage during a solar eclipse, well, congrats, you might have just cursed your bloodline. Hope the dowry was refundable. One particularly strange lesson involved what scholars now call flower combat. No, it wasn't actual fighting, it was a euphemism, a spiritual metaphor for sex. Male students would be taught to wage war on the flowered field, a poetic way of framing intimacy as both sacred and dangerous. Female students, meanwhile, were instructed in how to receive that combat with honour and cleanliness. They were told to be calm, receptive, and to pray beforehand to Xochiquetzal, the goddess of love and weaving, because nothing says ready for union like threading a loom with hummingbird feathers. But here's the thing, for all the talk of sacred energy and cosmic discipline, real life wasn't always so tidy. There were always students who rebelled. There's an account in the Florentine Codex of a group of Tenochtitlan boys who snuck out at night to visit a group of market girls. When caught, they were severely punished, flayed with medusae thorns, not because they'd had sex, but because they'd done it improperly, without ceremony, without respect, without awareness of the spiritual weight of the act. That's what the elders couldn't stand, not the act itself, but the casualness. And here's where the contradiction creeps in. These same boys were also being trained to become warriors who would someday take captives for sacrifice, many of whom were paraded as trophies during festivals that involved dancing, music, and often, let's be real, a heavy undercurrent of flirtation. The line between sacred discipline and sensual indulgence was thinner than it appeared. And the instructors? Not always paragons of restraint themselves. There's a blurry, half-erased passage in one codex that hints at a Calmacac instructor who was dismissed quietly after teaching the girls more than proper weaving. Whether that's a euphemism or just bad stitching is lost to history, but the implication's there. And scholars still debate how common such abuses of authority might have been. Then, of course, there were the unspoken lessons, the things whispered between students after dark, behind the painted columns of the temple school, how to kiss without smudging your ceremonial paint, which god was most forgiving if you couldn't resist temptation, how to avoid getting caught, and which servants could be bribed with a carved comb or a bag of roasted cacao beans. Girls, too, had their own codes. Taught to be modest, yes, but also shrewd. To listen, to observe, to learn how to manipulate a moment. There's one surviving testimony, collected by Spanish friars long after the conquest, that tells of a noble girl who faked her virginity test by pricking her finger and staining the wedding cloth herself. The midwife suspected, but said nothing. Why? Because that same girl had gifted her a rare turquoise bead a week before. Coincidence? Doubtful. The reality is, even within this tightly controlled moral framework, noble children were still children. Curious, rebellious, occasionally reckless. The system wanted to turn them into divine vessels, but it couldn't erase their humanity. And sometimes the gap between the two was the most educational part of all. You step now into a wide classroom, a covered stone patio with an open ceiling. The walls are painted with stars, feathers, and curved lines representing wind. A stack of reed mats lies in one corner. There's a broken bowl near the centre, once filled with water for ritual purification, and carved into the floor, nearly invisible after centuries of wear, is a single glyph. A flower, pierced by an arrow. Welcome to sex ed, Aztec style. Half metaphor, half discipline, and more real than anyone wanted to admit. Twilight creeps across the palace like a cat, soft and deliberate, as settling into corners and crevices as torches spark to life along the colonnades. You feel it before you see it, the scent of sweet rot, the trace of ash, and a strange perfume that reminds you of crushed violets left too long in the sun. You're entering the realm of Tlazolteotl now, the devourer of filth, the goddess of sins and their forgiveness. And oh, she has her own rituals, ones that take all the shame, lust, guilt, and secrecy of Aztec sexual life, and bake them into something both terrifying and oddly merciful. Tlazolteotl is not a goddess who fits neatly into categories. She is not simply good or evil. She is the patroness of filth and purification, of illicit desires and their cleansing. She's the one who watches from the shadows while you're misbehaving, and the one who holds your face when you're finally ready to confess. If Xochiquetzal is love's soft breath, Tlazolteotl is the heaving chest after betrayal. She is contradiction made to divine, and her worship was intense. Let's start with her most notorious ritual, Tlazoli Teochihuali, the cleansing confession. It was conducted privately, but not gently. When someone, usually a noble, was plagued by guilt for a sexual transgression, they could petition the priesthood to perform a ritual purification in her name. This wasn't a slap-on-the-wrist prayer and a try again next festival. No, this was a deep, physical, often humiliating process designed to extract the moral rot from the bones. The penitent would fast for several days, no food, no sex, no speaking unless spoken to. Then, on the appointed night, they were led to a secluded temple chamber, adorned with black and red flowers, ash-filled bowls, and glyphs of intertwined serpents. There, a priestess, often masked to represent Tlazolteotl herself, would hear the confession. Everything had to be spoken, in detail. Euphemisms were not allowed. The goddess demanded clarity. Once the confession was made, the purification began. For some, it involved ritual bathing, scrubbing the body with coarse herbs and river water, until the skin was red and raw. For others, it included bloodletting, especially from the tongue or earlobes, as a sign that the transgression had been spoken and heard. And in certain more extreme cases, usually when the offence was ongoing or involved high-ranking individuals, the ceremony included symbolic reenactments, a mock sexual act acted out in shame, often while covered in mud, to display the filth being admitted. Only afterward was the body anointed with perfumed oils and soothed by prayers. And here's the kicker. This wasn't punishment. It was healing. Because after all that, you were clean, spiritually reset. Your name, if not your reputation, was restored. Tlazolteotl, in her strange mercy, devoured the sin completely. It was her divine function, to eat moral filth like a jaguar eats bones, and leave nothing behind but spleens. That's why she was so widely feared and revered. She wasn't just the patron of adultery, lust, and indecent thoughts. She was the only god powerful enough to erase their consequences, not mitigate, not postpone, erase. That's divine authority you don't mess with. And yes, her rituals often involved sex, symbolic and real. One rite involved couples reenacting their transgressions in her temple under strict guidance. It wasn't for voyeurism, it was a performance of purification, designed to strip the act of secrecy and restore it to ritual honesty. Once you did it before Tlazolteotl, with no lies, no shadows, it no longer belonged to guilt, it belonged to her. Here's a fringe detail. Midwives often invoked her during childbirth. Because she wasn't just a goddess of adult sins, she was also believed to be present during those primal moments of creation and exposure. One chant addressed to her reads like a gentle threat. May the child be born clean, or may your mouth devour its wrongness. Comforting, it gets stranger. There are records of noble women praying to her before committing adultery, begging her forgiveness in advance, as if trying to schedule a future confession. That's how powerful her cleansing reputation was. People built their moral timelines around her. I'll do this tonight, confess at the next waning moon, and be spiritually clear before the festival. Imagine that kind of spiritual accounting. Or try putting that in a calendar invite. But Tlazolteotl wasn't just interested in nobles. Commoners, merchants, even warriors would seek her absolution, often in less elaborate ceremonies involving sweat baths and whispered prayers. But the underlying belief was always the same. She saw your darkest thoughts, and if you asked, she would eat them. This duality fascinated the Spanish chroniclers, who could not wrap their heads around a goddess who both encouraged and forgave sin. Madonna and whore in one, they muttered, missing the point completely. Tlazolteotl wasn't contradicting herself. She was the contradiction. She embodied the cycle. Desire, mistake, admission, forgiveness. Over and over like the waxing and waning of the moon. And yes, not everyone loved her. More conservative priests, especially those focused on solar deities and martial values, saw her cult as dangerously lenient, too emotional, too unpredictable. There are hints of political battles between temples, those who worshipped Tlazolteotl and those who preferred Tezcatlipoca, the flint-edged god of judgment and shadow. Let's just say, you'd rather bring your confessions to her than him. You find yourself now in one of her old chambers, the walls painted with faded reds and shadowy purples. At the centre is a worn stone bench, smooth from centuries of knees, backs, and broken whispers. Along the base of the wall is a series of carvings, a figure crying, a flower closing, a jaguar mouth opening wide. There's no gold here, no feathers, no polished obsidian, just silence, and the memory of voices giving up their secrets. Because in the palace of Aztec sexuality, nothing was final until Tlazolteotl had heard your story. And once she did, you either left clean, or not at all. The palace grows louder now, not with drums or priests, but with the unmistakable sounds of laughter, clapping, and something halfway between a chant and a joke shouted across a stone courtyard. You've wandered into the lighter side of the royal compound, well, as light as things get in a place ruled by bloodlines, prophecy and politically strategic marriages. But make no mistake, you're still on sacred ground, even if it smells more like roasted maize and pulque than incense. Because tonight we step into the world of court jesters, the entertainers, fools, dancers, and singers who kept the elite smiling. And yes, some of them had benefits. The Aztecs called them huehue, a term that meant old man or sage fool, but don't let the name fool you. These weren't just grizzled comedians staggering around in jaguar print loincloths. Some were barely past adolescence, others long past their fighting years. Their real job was simple, make the rulers laugh. But beneath that, a much more complex role. They were truth speakers, gossip catchers, improvisers, actors, and, in some cases, emotional companions. Now here's the spicy bit. In Aztec courts, where nearly every relationship was dictated by lineage or ritual, jesters floated outside the hierarchy. They could insult nobles, tease the emperor, even impersonate priests in satire skits, all without punishment. They were untouchable in a way that made everyone else both jealous and suspicious. They had access to every wing of the palace. They wandered freely, slipped through parties, entertained during royal feasts, and sometimes slipped into beds. You heard that right. Several oral traditions, mostly kept alive through Nahua storytelling and songs, suggest that certain court jesters weren't just there to perform. They were lovers, companions, occasional confidants in the physical sense, especially for noble women kept tightly under watch. Now, this wasn't some sort of organised scandal. You didn't have jesters lining up outside chambers like they were at some exclusive club, but in a palace where rules pressed down like stone, the court fool could be the only person allowed to speak freely. And that kind of emotional freedom? That's intoxicating. Let's talk about the performances first. Jesters at the palace played many roles. Some dressed as animals, others mimicked foreign ambassadors, while others danced erotically at festivals, playfully exaggerating the gestures of gods like Xochipilli or Tlazolteotl. These acts were meant to mock and delight, to let the court laugh at its own absurdity. One popular routine involved a mock wedding between a frog and a hummingbird, with the fool acting out the bride's frustration over the groom's unusual anatomy. PG? Absolutely not. But spiritually therapeutic? Surprisingly, yes, that was the point. The Aztecs didn't see sexuality as something to lock away. They saw it as a force that needed balancing, laughing at, exalting, and occasionally indulging. The jester was the release valve, the one person who could poke fun at imperial dignity without risking decapitation. And in that role, they gained something priceless: access. Now let's peel back the velvet a bit. There's a story, recorded decades after the fall of Tenochtitlan, of a jester named Toll, known for his bird impressions and ability to walk on his hands for the length of a courtyard. He was said to have been particularly close to one of the emperor's wives, a woman whose name was scrubbed from most codices, but who appears in fragments as she of the distant eyes. The two were often seen together at feasts, whispering jokes. When questioned, Toll claimed he was simply teaching her to laugh, but when she disappeared from court and was later found living in a mountain shrine, Toll was reassigned to the emperor's youngest daughter. The implication, clear enough. Oofy. Sometimes, laughter leads to more than jokes. Here's the fringe detail that scholars still debate. Some jesters were trained not just in song and satire, but in massage, sensual performance, and erotic storytelling. Like a mashup of entertainer, therapist, and consort, all in one unpredictable package. Were they officially part of the emperor's sexual sphere? Not openly, but their proximity to the harem and the way women sometimes requested them specifically during festivals makes it hard to ignore. And while most of this was discreet, not all of it stayed secret. There was one recorded scandal involving a high-ranking concubine who laughed too freely at a jester's song mocking her own husband. He had been gone on campaign for 2 years, and when he returned, someone slipped him a crude painting featuring her and the jester, let's just say in a non-ritual position. The painting's accuracy is debated, but the fallout was immediate. The jester vanished, either exiled or sacrificed, and the concubine was reassigned to the temple of Chalchiuhtlicue, goddess of rivers. That might sound like a promotion, but it wasn't. More like a glorified retirement home for women who'd become inconvenient. But it's not all doom and punishment. In many cases, these relationships between jesters and nobles were understood, tolerated even, so long as they didn't disrupt alliances or produce illegitimate children. Some nobles even considered it trendy to have a favoured fool at their side. A jester at the table means joy in the heart, an old palace saying goes. Joy, of course, being a wonderfully vague term. And it wasn't just women. Male nobles sometimes kept jesters as confidants, and, on occasion, more than that. Xochipilli, the god of music and male love, was invoked at certain private gatherings where jesters played the flute while nobles drank fermented cacao. Let your imagination wander, and it probably won't go far enough. There's debate, even now, about whether these court entertainers should be seen as victims or the masters of their own game. Were they exploited? Maybe, but they also navigated the palace like shadows, unpredictable, ungoverned, and often one step ahead of their audience. In a system where everything was scripted, the jester improvised. That was their gift, and for some, that freedom turned into a kind of power that outlasted even the throne. You stand now in an open courtyard near the palace theatre. The air is filled with the echoes of laughter long turned to dust. A flute leans against a chipped column. Feathers from a broken headdress lie curled in the corner like sleeping snakes. You can almost hear someone say, "Did you hear the one about the emperor and the priest's daughter?" And for a moment the stone smiles. because even in the dead seriousness of an empire built on ritual, laughter was allowed, desired even. And when that laughter came with a wink, a touch, a night hidden behind the curtains of power, well, the gods weren't always watching, and if they were, sometimes they laughed too. It's after dark now, and the palace is a different animal. Gone is the formal procession of priests and diplomats, the echo of feathered sandals and ceremonial chants. Now the corridors are quiet, the windows are open, the soft buzz of crickets hums beneath the moonlight. And while the official rules of the empire still loom large, they feel a little thinner here, stretched taut across the sleeping city. Tonight, you follow a trail that leads beyond the bounds of protocol, into the secret lives of nobles who slipped away from their expected partners and fell into the arms of the unthinkable, commoners. Let's be clear, from the outset, this wasn't allowed. Noble blood was divine, sacred, meant to mingle only with other noble blood. The same way gold is never alloyed with clay. The children of nobles were born with responsibility stitched into their bones. To taint that lineage with the touch of someone beneath your station was more than rebellion. It was heresy. And yet, it happened. Often enough that the courts had rules for what to do when it did. Picture a noblewoman in her 20s, married off young, raised to move like a statue and speak only when asked. Her husband is away on campaign or drunk, or obsessed with producing a male heir she has failed to deliver. Meanwhile, a palace servant, strong, attentive, quiet, catches her gaze one day while laying out ceremonial garlands. Nothing is said, nothing needs to be. By the time she places a flower behind his ear during the next feast, the message is clear. They meet later, in the shadow of the steam bath or the gardens beyond the aviary, where no priest walks after dark. It's easy to romanticize this, and in some cases, it probably was romantic, the noble taking a risk, the commoner knowing full well the danger, but stepping forward anyway. But make no mistake, the stakes were deadly. If caught, the commoner would likely be sacrificed, not just executed, but ceremonially killed to erase the shame from the bloodline. The noble, punished, sometimes publicly, more often quietly erased, shipped to a distant temple, married off again, or simply stripped of her status and replaced. There's a haunting story, passed down through oral tradition, about a young scribe named Yaotl who worked in the palace archives. He was known for his flawless glyph work, but also for his beauty: long black hair, high cheekbones, quiet hands. One of the emperor's nieces, never named directly in any codex, began requesting him for private readings. She claimed she wanted to study ancient poetry. She learned much more than that. Their affair lasted months, hidden in the creases of scrolls and between readings of sacred verse. When they were caught, the punishment was swift. Yaotl was sacrificed during the next festival of Tezcatlipoca. She was sent to live in the House of the Dying Flowers, a euphemism for a temple where disgraced noble women were cloistered until death. But their story lived on in glyphs scratched into the base of the archive wall, 2 hands reaching across an open book. And here's a strange detail. Some commoners believed that sleeping with a noble could change their fate, that it could somehow elevate their tenali, their inner fire. It's unclear whether this was superstition or desperation, but there were stories, more legend than history, of lucky lovers who escaped punishment, even married into lower noble families after surviving scandal. One man, a palace gardener, was reportedly spared because the emperor found the entire affair amusing. He watered her like the maize, the emperor joked. The man was reassigned to a less visible job, tending the emperor's private chili grove, but far more often it ended badly. What's interesting is how secretly tolerated some of these relationships were. Servants knew, guards looked the other way. Older concubines, bored of policing each other, sometimes helped facilitate the meetings, either out of pity or because they remembered being young themselves. As long as no one got pregnant and no one was caught too publicly, the palace machine kept turning. The illusion of purity remained intact. Of course, pregnancy did happen, and when it did, things became complicated. There are records, veiled in euphemism, of noble children being born under dark stars, then quietly sent to temples or killed in their first days of life. Other times, the mother claimed illness, and the child was never acknowledged. A few lucky ones were adopted by lower-tier nobles and raised far from court, their true parentage whispered only in the lull between stories. This wasn't limited to noble women either. Young noblemen, especially second or third sons without clear political marriages lined up, sometimes took lovers among the palace workers. Cooks, bath attendants, even foreign captives, brought to court as tribute or gifts. These relationships were usually short-lived, but not always. One noble, a cousin of the emperor, reportedly kept the same lover, an artisan who crafted ceremonial jewellery, for over a decade. They were discreet, smart. Eventually the artisan was granted noble status. For exemplary craftsmanship, the official reason said. But those close to the court knew better. And here's the open debate among historians. Were these liaisons truly rare and scandalous? Or were they simply recorded as rare, when in fact they were relatively common but carefully managed? The reality is, the Aztec elite were intensely pragmatic. If a noble was discreet, productive, and didn't rock the political boat, their personal dalliances could be overlooked. What mattered was appearances, alliances, and legacy. Still, the threat of punishment loomed. There was even a special position in the palace, a priest judge whose job included hearing accusations of sexual misconduct between nobles and commoners. These trials were usually short. If the evidence was strong, a witness, a pregnancy, a love token, they didn't end in appeals. They ended in ritual, blood, cleansing silence, and yet, people kept falling in love, or lust, or need, or something that felt like freedom in a world made of stone and lineage charts. Because desire doesn't care about bloodlines. And in a palace that watched everything, sometimes the only privacy anyone had was found in risk. You're standing now at the edge of the outer gardens, where the noble terraces meet the workers' paths. There's a narrow alcove between the wall and the hedges, just wide enough for two people to sit shoulder to shoulder. Carved into the stone nearby are two glyphs, a jaguar and a dove. The combination doesn't appear in any official records, but in whispered poetry it means hidden fire. And tonight, you understand it completely. The palace grows hushed again, but this time it isn't the serenity of twilight or the private lull of lovers after dark. This is that eerie stillness that comes just before a scandal erupts, the collective breath held by an entire empire bracing for what comes next. Because even in a world where sexuality was tangled into religion, lineage, and power, there were lines you didn't cross. And one emperor, young, bold, and just a little too confident, did exactly that. Tonight you're stepping into the Feather Palace and the scandal that nearly tore the empire apart. They called it the Feather Palace, not because it was literally made of feathers, but because every inch of it was draped, painted, and embroidered in quetzal plumes, hummingbird wings, and macaw reds. It was the residence of Emperor Axayacatl during the height of his reign, and it became infamous for its splendor, its excess, and, eventually, its betrayal. The story begins like 100 others, a celebration, a diplomatic feast. Representatives from tributary city-states gathered to reaffirm loyalty, deliver gifts, and engage in the carefully choreographed dance of alliance building. Among these was a young princess from Tlaxcala, brought as a gesture of good faith after a particularly bitter skirmish. Her name? No longer remembered. She's referred to in most sources only as Xochihuitl, flower feather. And even that might be poetic invention. But what's clear is this: she was not meant to be touched. In Aztec diplomacy, gifting daughters to the emperor was standard, but there were rules. Some women were given as wives, others as concubines, and some, like Xochihuitl, were symbols, untouchable tokens of peace. She was too politically important to be bedded, too fresh from a fragile alliance to be claimed. At least not yet, at least not until the right number of seasons had passed, rituals observed, priests consulted. Axayacatl did not wait. According to the chronicles, both indigenous and Spanish, he took her that same night. No ceremony, no petition to the gods, no waiting for omens. She was led from the diplomatic court into the Feather Palace and did not return until morning. The aftermath was immediate. Her attendants panicked. The priests scrambled. Messengers were sent to Tlaxcala to soften the blow, but it was too late. The act wasn't just a scandal, it was a slap across the face of an entire rival city-state, one known for its fierce independence and touchy pride. For a moment, war seemed inevitable. And not just political war, this had the weight of religious outrage behind it. The gods had been bypassed. Sacred order had been disrupted. A woman meant to be honoured had been used. But here's where things get complicated. Xochihuitl didn't denounce him. In fact, some accounts claim she claimed him, openly referring to herself as his chosen consort in the weeks that followed. She wore his colours, appeared in court by his side, and according to one poem scrawled into the margins of a priest's journal, she began invoking Tlazolteotl in daily offerings, a bold nod to passion, sin, and its purification. Was this love? A calculated political move? or Stockholm Syndrome pre-conquest edition, we'll never know. What we do know is that the palace turned against her. The emperor's other wives hated her, not just for her sudden influence, but for the way she skipped the line. She didn't rise through rituals, she didn't earn favour over time, she arrived and took. Jealousy roiled. Rumours began that she'd cursed him, that she carried a serpent's blood, that her children would be born malformed as punishment from the gods. And then came the worst. Accusations that she had seduced him on purpose to sow chaos in the court. There's no evidence of any of that. But fear doesn't need facts. As tensions rose, the Feather Palace became a political volcano. Nobles allied with Tlaxcala were suddenly persona non grata. Priests debated whether a ritual re-cleansing of the emperor was necessary. One even suggested he temporarily abdicate to purify his spirit. That priest later died mysteriously in the steam bath, heart failure at 30. Meanwhile, Xochicuitl was seen less and less. The final blow came during a spring festival honouring Xochiquetzal, goddess of love and beauty. The emperor was expected to parade his principal wives through the city. Xochicuitl insisted on marching too. The priests objected, so did the elders. The emperor wavered. Then, on the morning of the parade, she emerged dressed as the goddess herself, draped in embroidered jade, crowned with quetzal feathers, her skin painted with gold dust. It was breathtaking and unforgivable. She was never seen again. The official record claims she died suddenly of illness that very night. Fever, they said. But those close to the court knew better. Some claimed she was sacrificed, offered to the gods she had offended. Others believed she was exiled to a remote temple where silence was enforced with ritual tongue-cutting. A few whispered that she escaped, hidden by sympathetic servants, and lived out her days weaving cloaks in a fishing village on the eastern coast. What happened to Xochicuitl? He survived the scandal, but not untouched. His next campaign failed, his health declined. His political alliances grew brittle. Some said he had been cursed by Xochicuitl's blood, that the gods punished him not for the act itself, but for the arrogance of thinking he could rewrite sacred order. Even centuries later, the tale of the Feather Palace scandal lingered, in hushed stories and nighttime songs. It was a cautionary tale dressed as a romance. Don't touch what hasn't been offered. Don't assume your power protects you from cosmic consequence. Don't mistake desire for divine right. There's scholarly debate over the story's accuracy. Some argue it was exaggerated by post-conquest writers trying to demonize Aztec rulers. Others believe it's a parable, real names replaced, real events softened into metaphor. But the elements ring true. The palace was a powder keg of hierarchy, symbolism and sex, and one misstep, no matter how passionate, could send shockwaves across the empire. Now, you walk the edge of what once was the Feather Palace. Only the foundations remain now, cracked and moss-covered. But if you lean close, you'll see a single carved tile left intact, hidden beneath a fallen column. 2 feathers crossed over a stylized flower, not part of any official glyph. Maybe a signature, maybe a warning. Either way, she's not forgotten. The Feather Palace fades behind you like a bad memory draped in gold. But something from that story lingers. A sense that even in an empire obsessed with order and ritual, secrets had their own ecosystems. And nowhere was this more obvious than in the Temazcal, the Aztec steam bath. At first glance, it's nothing remarkable. A low, rounded dome, often made of volcanic rock, small enough to feel intimate, but just big enough for a few bodies to huddle inside. It smells of wet stone, eucalyptus, and centuries of sweat. But tonight, we're not here for a spa treatment. We're here for the whispers in the steam. The Temazcal was sacred, yes. It symbolized the womb of the earth. You entered it to be cleansed, not just physically but spiritually. Warriors bathed before and after battle. Women entered it before childbirth. Priests used it for purification before rituals. But somewhere along the way, this sacred site also became a grey zone. A place where rules could melt just a little, where secrets could breathe, where power could relax, and sometimes misbehave. Let's start with the obvious. Sweat loosens more than muscles. It loosens tongues. Inside the Temazcal, rank softened. Nobles sat beside warriors. Priestesses beside courtiers. The heat levelled everyone. Faces ran with sweat. Hierarchy blurred through the steam, and in that blurring something remarkable happened. People talked. In whispers, of course, gossip, confessions, quiet negotiations. There are stories of feuds born and resolved here, of alliances whispered into existence between stifled gasps. And yes, it was also a place of seduction. Steam has a way of hiding what it needs to hide. A brush of the arm becomes a moment. A shared bowl of herbs becomes an excuse to lean closer. Sometimes women scheduled their sessions together for reasons that had nothing to do with sweat. Sometimes men emerged with knowing looks and nothing else said. And sometimes, when no one else was scheduled for the hour, the Temazcal became a private room for two people who shouldn't have been alone together. One such story survives in pieces, passed down through a mix of colonial commentary and Nahua oral tradition. It's about a widow, a noble woman once married to a high priest who used the Temazcal regularly in her morning ritual. Quiet, respected, pious. Until a new steward was assigned to oversee the baths, a man from a rival city-state known for his hands more than his words. The story goes that they shared the steam regularly, under the guise of maintaining ceremonial hygiene. It went on for a year, until someone, jealous or simply nosy, slipped a bone carving of two intertwined serpents under the widow's bath mat. A not-so-subtle accusation. She was gone by the next moon cycle. No one ever saw the steward again. The bathhouse closed for repairs for 6 weeks. But let's not get too romantic. Not all encounters here were consensual. The steam bath, for all its spiritual gravity, had shadows. There are mentions, fleeting, uncomfortable, of lower-ranking attendants being pressured, manipulated, or even forced by nobles who use the sanctity of the space as cover. Rare? Maybe. But when your body is already exposed, your guard lowered by heat, your breath tight from the smoke of burning herbs, it doesn't take much. It's a reminder that even sacred places can be exploited. Still, for many, the Temazcal was a haven. A place to confess without judgment, to flirt without audience, to wash away both sin and suspicion. Here's where things get strange. In some rituals, the Temazcal was used not just before sex, but as the setting for sex, ritualized, orchestrated, and guided by priests. Especially during fertility festivals, certain noble couples would be encouraged to engage in sacred union inside the bath, surrounded by flower garlands, burning copal, and chanting outside the walls. No one could see inside, but they could hear, and that was the point. The union wasn't performed for privacy, it was offered up for the gods to witness through sound and scent. Participants emerged soaked and glowing not just from exertion, but from the belief that their act had restored some cosmic balance. These rituals weren't frequent, but they were memorable, and stories of them lived long after the steam cleared. There's a fringe fact that's often overlooked. Some Temazcals were built with hidden tunnels, ventilation shafts, supposedly, but wide enough for someone to slip in or out unnoticed. The implication is obvious. Sometimes what started as a solitary steam turned into something more inclusive. Scholars debate whether these visits were prearranged or spontaneous, but given how meticulously palace life was scheduled, let's be real, nothing was ever truly spontaneous. Someone always knew. Even so, the Temazcal remained untouchable in its sacred identity. No one openly condemned what happened there. No record survived that listed it as a site of sin or scandal, because to do so would be to question its role in the spiritual structure of the empire. You didn't mess with the Temazcal. It was too useful, too revered, too entangled with the cycles of life and death. And maybe that's why so much happened there, because it wasn't just a bathhouse, it was a liminal space, a place where rules faded like mist, where bodies softened and masks slipped. Where the earth's heat swallowed your secrets and sent them up in smoke, you stand now at the threshold of a surviving Temazcal, the roof long gone, but the stone still warm from centuries of ritual. You can see the grooves where water flowed, the soot stains from generations of fires, and on the inner wall, nearly invisible, unless you catch the light just right, a faint glyph, a spiral beside a flowering heart, the symbol for soul uncoiled, and maybe that's what the bath was for. Not just to cleanse, not just to seduce, but to uncoil all the tangled parts of you and let them stretch, breathe, and, for a moment, exist without judgment. Because in a world of gods and emperors, this was one of the few places where your body belonged to no one else, mourning again. And this one is different, not drowsy with the haze of ritual or thick with incense, but clear, sharp, mathematical. You can almost hear the grinding of gears that don't exist yet, the cold certainty of celestial precision. This is the Empire's secret pulse, the one that beats not in hearts but in stars. Because tonight, or rather this morning, you're stepping into the eerie symmetry between sex and astronomy. Yes, you read that right. For the Aztec elite, even that was regulated by the sky. Welcome to cosmic climaxes and celestial timing. First, understand this. Time was everything to the Aztecs. Every act, eating, praying, walking, breathing, had its rightful moment in the sacred calendar. They used two calendars to be specific, the Tonalpohualli, a 260-day sacred cycle, and the Xiuhpohualli, the 365-day solar calendar. These overlapped like rotating gears, aligning at key moments to determine festivals, battles, coronations, and yes, when it was most favourable to have sex. Not just for fun, for fertility, for cosmic harmony, for the empire. This wasn't about love, this was astrophysical duty. High-ranking nobles consulted diviners before bedding their partners, especially when they wanted children. The question wasn't, are we in the mood? It was, is the god of this day compatible with the function of our union? If not, forget it. Even the emperor himself could be advised to abstain on certain dates, lest the resulting child be cursed, weak, or spiritually chaotic. Let's take Venus as an example. The Aztecs were obsessed with her. The planet, not the Roman goddess. To them, she was Tlahuizcalpantecutli, the lord of the House of Dawn, and her heliacal rise and setting were used to mark favourable or dangerous days for a hem-intimate behaviour. Venus was a volatile presence, sometimes considered benevolent, sometimes a bringer of death. One phase of her cycle, for instance, was believed to be especially fertile for producing future warriors, but only if the union occurred under strict silence. No moaning, no talking, just action and spiritual focus. Imagine that. You're lying in bed with someone you're technically allowed to be with in a palace filled with flowers and soft fabrics, and a priest knocks on your door like, good news! The stars say tonight's the night, but only if you're completely silent, facing east, and finish before the moon rises above the third column. Romantic? Not even slightly, but effective, according to them, absolutely. There's a particular glyph, one that appears repeatedly in both ceremonial garments and birth records, depicting two intertwined bodies surrounded by constellations. Scholars believe this image wasn't decorative. It was a reference guide, a sexual calendar carved into fabric. The placement of stars around the figures indicated the best times for conception based on astrology. If your midwife knew how to read it, she could tell you not only when to try, but what kind of soul you were inviting into the world. But it didn't stop there. The moon too had a say. Certain phases were off limits for sex entirely, particularly the waning crescent, which was believed to drain vitality and create unstable offspring. Other phases were reserved for non-reproductive unions, meaning that during these nights, intimacy was permitted, but only as a bonding ritual, not for the creation of life. Again, diviners would advise couples accordingly. Imagine scheduling your affection around a cosmic spreadsheet. And it wasn't just about reproduction. The act itself, especially when performed in ceremonial spaces, was considered a way of syncing human rhythm with celestial cycles. Some rituals called for noble couples to engage in sex at the exact moment of an eclipse, believing that their union helped realign the forces that held the heavens in balance. It was less about the orgasm and more about the timing. You weren't climaxing for each other. You were climaxing for the gods. Now you might be wondering, did people actually follow all of this? The answer is yes. Or at least enough of them did that entire classes of priests, midwives, and astrologers were devoted to managing the sexual calendars of the elite. Remember, this was a culture where everything, rain, maize, death, birth, depended on spiritual alignment. Sex was not exempt. If anything, it was the ultimate point of convergence. Pleasure, power, procreation, all in one vulnerable act. Of course the stars had a say. And here's a weird fringe detail, certain noblemen wore jewellery etched with glyphs of their birthday, intended to act as compatibility markers. When a union was being arranged, the couple's glyphs were compared. If the match was harmonious, the marriage proceeded. If not, the couple might still wed, but they were warned to abstain on certain days or risk spiritual disruption. Basically, it was an ancient, obsidian-encrusted version of zodiac dating apps. Now, not every noble followed these rules strictly. Some got impatient. Others rejected them altogether, especially during periods of crisis or grief. There's one record of a noblewoman who lost her husband in battle and took a new lover that same night, On a date considered astrologically cursed, she conceived. The child was born with a limp. Whether that was coincidence or guilt turned into legend, we'll never know. But her story was told again and again as a warning. The stars don't forget. Still, some pushed the boundaries intentionally. A few nobles became obsessed with testing the rules, seeing what would happen if they defied the calendars. One eccentric prince reportedly scheduled his unions on bad days on purpose, hoping to summon wild children who would break patterns and reshape the world. His first child died in infancy. His second became a poet-priest famous for his chaotic rituals. His third vanished from the records completely. His house eventually lost its claim to the court. Interpret that however you like. You stand now beneath a stone arch that once held an observatory. Nothing remains but the base and a few worn carvings, including one of two lovers surrounded by spiralling stars. It's not sensual. It's geometric. Precise. There's a small groove in the stone floor, aligned perfectly with the sunrise on the spring equinox. This wasn't built for romance. This was built for syncopation. Because in the Aztec world, sex wasn't random. It was planned, mapped, studied. The sky watched you and you watched it back. And when your bodies moved together, under the right constellation, in the right season, with the right god watching, you weren't just making love. You were making balance. It's late again. And this time you're being drawn into a quieter chamber. One that smells of milk, salt, and something sweet. Almost like tamarind left in the sun. The shadows here are soft, the light dappled and low. And for once, the atmosphere feels tender. Not ceremonial, not scandalous, just human. But don't let that softness fool you, because under the surface of this story is a sharp truth about class, bodies, and hidden intimacy. Tonight, we follow the secret life of the wet nurse, and how this humble role sometimes blurred into the world of royal concubinage. In the Aztec world, Tlazolquetzk, or wet nurses, were not just breastfeeding labourers. They were spiritual guardians, teachers, comforters, and, if you read between the lines, sometimes something more. Their job was essential, to nourish the children of nobles, especially when a mother had died, or more often, when she was simply too high-ranking to be bothered with the act of feeding herself. Yes, even motherhood was subject to the hierarchy, and so these women stepped in. The bond between a wet nurse and a child was intimate from the start. She held them, bathed them, soothed them during fevers and nightmares. She was a presence before the child could speak, before the mother might even notice her own offspring had grown teeth. And for the young nobles, especially sons, this first bond with a woman who wasn't their mother often left a deep imprint. Now here's where things start to blur. Once the child grew older and no longer needed milk, the nurse often remained in the palace, not always as a servant, sometimes as an advisor, a confidant, a quiet guardian behind the scenes, and sometimes, especially if she was young and beautiful, her role shifted again. She became a companion, first emotionally then physically. Now, officially, this wasn't sanctioned. Wet nurses weren't supposed to become lovers. They were not of noble blood. They weren't vetted by astrologers or trained for politics. But it happened anyway, in the spaces between rules, as so many things did. One recorded story, half lost in the poetry of a minor noble's autobiography, tells of a young prince who fell in love with the woman who raised him. She was older than him by 10 years, and she had served his mother before she died in childbirth. By the time he reached 17, their connection had deepened into something far more complicated. It wasn't just lust. It was dependency, memory, and longing all tangled together. He asked the emperor, his uncle, for permission to elevate her to a formal concubine. The request was denied. 3 weeks later, she was found dead in the steam bath. The prince claimed it was suicide. Others whispered poison. Either way, the message was clear. The role of the nurse ended at the nipple. Anything more was dangerous, but that didn't stop it from happening. Some nurses were protected, quietly promoted, given rooms in the women's quarters, dressed in better cotton, no longer expected to clean or cook. Their official titles? Caretakers, attendants, senior household women. Unofficially, they were something more. Lovers, not mistresses in the way that nobles might have concubines for politics or show. These relationships were different, built on years of care, of whispered lullabies and fevered prayers, and when the child grew, they sometimes returned that intimacy in ways no one else could match. Fringe fact incoming: some wet nurses were trained not just in feeding, but in midwifery, massage, and even emotional healing. They could chant lullabies that doubled as protective spells. They knew which herbs calmed the stomach and which ones dulled grief. In this way, they held an unofficial priestess role, especially in households where the mother had died or withdrawn into ritual duties. And occasionally, just occasionally, they were called upon to test the sexual maturity of young noblemen before their first official union. This part of history is murky and uncomfortable, and scholars still argue about it. Was it sanctioned, implied, invented after the fact by colonial chroniclers trying to paint Aztecs as licentious? Possibly all three, but the stories persist. One account, written by a Spanish friar who claimed to have interviewed former court servants, describes an elderly nurse who tearfully admitted she had been used this way 3 times for sons of the same noble house. Each time she was told it was an honour, a right, that her body was part of the boy's preparation. She claimed she never enjoyed it, but also that she never said no. What do you do with that? Aztec society didn't have clean categories for these women. They were sacred and invisible, revered and overlooked. Their bodies were sites of nurture and occasionally of quiet transgression. The palace needed them, but also tried to forget them, and yet their influence lingered. In birth records, the wet nurse's name was sometimes etched in the margins, not officially, but as a kind of footnote. In songs and laments, a few verses survive about the second mother, she of the warm breast, the hand that steadies the storm. You can feel the affection, the nostalgia. You can also feel the loneliness, because in the end, they rarely kept their place in the family they helped raise. Once the noble child married, once the heir was secured, the nurse became obsolete. Some were given stipends and returned to their village. Others were married off to minor servants. A few remained, growing grey in the palace shadows. And some, the lucky ones, or perhaps the doomed, were kept close, not officially, not permanently, but close enough to be remembered in the way that really mattered. You find yourself now in a smaller chamber off the women's quarter. A cradle rests in the corner carved with feathers and maize. A bench sits by the window smoothed by years of weight. And tucked beneath it, faintly scratched into the stone floor, are 3 symbols. A hand, a breast, and a flowering heart. No name, no title, just the memory of someone who gave everything and asked for nothing except perhaps to be seen. It's storming now, thick clouds roiling over the mountains, the kind of sky that makes stone temples feel smaller than they are. Thunder rumbles somewhere in the distance, and the scent of wet earth and rain-slicked obsidian creeps through the palace corridors. Appropriate, really. Because tonight's subject is darker than most. You've wandered into the sharp, cold heart of the imperial law, where desire wasn't just dangerous, it was punishable by death. This is the side of Aztec sexuality they don't carve into temples, the sex crimes, and the brutal, deliberate machinery of justice that followed. Let's not sugarcoat it. The Aztecs were precise, even poetic, when it came to sex in ritual and social life. But when boundaries were broken, consent ignored, lines crossed, they didn't flinch. Their legal system swung down like a flint blade, fast and final. Start with adultery. In noble society, adultery was more than a personal betrayal, it was a political forbid. When bloodlines were tied to cosmic order, sleeping outside your sanctioned circle meant destabilizing that entire structure. If a nobleman slept with another man's wife, the consequences were swift, death. Sometimes by strangulation, other times by stoning, or, if the act was considered especially offensive, public humiliation followed by execution. A particularly theatrical punishment involved tying the guilty lovers together, covering them in feathers, and parading them through the marketplace before sacrifice. The message was clear: you are not just punished, you are exampled. But the rules weren't symmetrical. Women accused of adultery often faced harsher outcomes. For wives of nobles, the usual method was strangulation with magway cords. Not just because it killed, but because the cords, sacred tools in Aztec ritual, symbolized purification through pain. In a particularly brutal twist, sometimes the cord was made from the same fibers used to wrap sacred manuscripts, as if to remind the condemned that their failure was a corruption of something divine. Still, not every accusation led to death. If a woman could prove coercion, or that the man used magic, potions, or dreams to seduce her, she might be spared. Might. But proving anything in a system where power decided the outcome? That was another story. And here's where things get really complicated. Some sexual acts were crimes only if done wrong. Sex with a concubine? Fine. Sex with a concubine during a forbidden ritual night, crime. Intimacy between nobles of equal status, acceptable. Intimacy across caste lines, especially without permission, crime. In fact, one of the most aggressively punished offences was what they called tlakochkalkatl mitzlia, to leap over the spear of rank. In other words, to sleep with someone above your class. Even consensual relationships between nobles and commoners could lead to brutal punishment if they produced children. Those offspring were considered anomalous, spiritually unaligned, and likely to upset inheritance lines. If discovered, the parents faced death, the child, often killed in infancy or hidden away, unacknowledged forever. And then there were the true horrors: coercion, rape, and assault. The Aztecs did not use euphemism here. The language in the legal codices is direct, even graphic. If a man assaulted a woman, he was usually executed by clubbing or burning. No trial, no second chances. In cases where the woman was of noble blood, the punishment could extend to the assailant's family. His home might be burned, his brothers exiled. The stain spread deliberately, like spiritual bleach. There's a record, almost too painful to read, of a court musician who forced himself on a palace maiden. The emperor didn't just order his execution. He summoned the man's teacher, the one who had trained him in flute and poetry, and held him responsible as well. "You taught him to charm," the emperor said. "You failed to teach him restraint." That teacher was stripped of his titles and sent to serve in the temple of Xipe-Totec, where flayed skin hung like laundry and shame lived permanently in the air. Not all punishments ended in death. Some left permanent marks, literally. If a noble was caught in a minor sexual crime, say public indecency or unwanted advances, they might be tattooed or scarred. One common mark was a blackened spiral on the neck, indicating tongue without restraint. Another was a broken flower carved into the thigh, a visual warning to future lovers. And let's talk briefly about same-sex relationships. The Aztec view wasn't as binary as later European interpretations claimed. Male-male intimacy existed, especially in temples devoted to Xochipilli, the god of beauty and male love. But it had rules. Status mattered, age mattered, mutual respect mattered. If a nobleman was found using his rank to coerce a lower-class man, even if the act was consensual in body, it could still be punished, often with exile or symbolic castration. Not physical removal, but forced celibacy through ritual vows and public disgrace. Fringe detail: some of these rituals were theatrical. There's one account of a noble who broke his celibacy vow and was forced to parade naked through a festival while carrying a torch and singing about his failure. Everyone laughed. Then he was sacrificed. Guess the punchline came late. Of course, not everyone was punished equally. The elite found ways to dodge justice, bribing priests, faking omens, offering slaves in their place. There's one notorious story of a noble who seduced a priestess of Chalchiuhtlicue, goddess of lakes. She was discovered, imprisoned, and executed. He donated a gold statue to the temple and walked away with a warning. Later, his own wife poisoned him with a stew thickened by morning glory seeds. They called it divine justice, or maybe just excellent timing. There's still debate among scholars about how much of this was consistently enforced. Did every offence end in death? Or was there room for discretion, forgiveness, politics? Some argue that sex laws were harsher on paper than in practice, a kind of psychological control mechanism. Others point to the sheer number of recorded executions and say no, this wasn't symbolic. This was very real. You're now standing in a quiet part of the palace, a courtyard with worn stone seats and a low wall of basalt. At the centre, a flat execution stone lies half sunk in the ground. Not dramatic, not bloody, just there, heavy with history. On one corner, the glyph for justice. On the other, the spiral of speech. Together they meant judgment spoken, fate sealed. Because in this empire, sex was sacred. But cross the line and the gods wouldn't be the ones to punish you. The state would. Dawn again, but this time it's different. The air feels thinner, quieter. The birds aren't singing, they're just watching. You're standing in the oldest part of the royal complex now, where the stones have been worn smooth by bare feet and tears. This is not a place for the living. Not exactly. This is where the dead are prepared, honoured and remembered. But even here the Aztecs didn't forget the flesh. Tonight, or maybe forever, we drift into what came after all the love, lust, scandal, and punishment. Tonight, We're talking about what the Aztecs believed happened to sexuality in the afterlife. Now, let's be clear. The Aztec underworld wasn't some simple heaven and hell operation. It was a complex, multi-layered cosmology where your death's method determined your soul's fate. Not your morality, not your piety. Die in battle. You rise with the sun, die in childbirth. You follow the moon, drown. You're given to Tlaloc's paradise. Die of disease, old age, or just because your heart decided it was tired. Welcome to Mictlan, the underworld. A place of wind, jaguars, trials, and surprisingly, echoes of pleasure. This is where things get interesting, because the Aztecs didn't believe you just dropped your body at the door of death like a pair of old sandals. No, you carried parts of it with you. Your tonali, your heat, your essence. That stayed. It wasn't lust in the living sense, but a kind of emotional hunger that followed you into the next world. Desire didn't die, it matured. In some stories, lovers who died tragically, separated by war or politics, were allowed to reunite in the underworld. Not as ghosts fumbling awkwardly in the shadows, but as honoured souls who completed each other's journeys. There's a myth of a noble woman who died in childbirth, ascending as a Quihueteteo, a spirit woman who haunted crossroads. Her lover, a warrior who later died in battle, supposedly met her at the moment of his death, and together they circled the sun, passing each other at dusk and dawn in a cycle of eternal reunion. That's romantic, right? But don't get too cozy. The afterlife could be sensual, yes, but it could also be hungry. In Tlalocan, the paradise of rain and fertility, the dead were believed to indulge in endless pleasures. Fruits, warmth, sensual dances under waterfalls that never ended. Not just innocent stuff either. The murals from temple walls hint at men and women dancing in ways that weren't exactly PG. One even shows a couple joined in embrace beneath a tree that appears to grow from their bodies. Interpret as you will. In contrast, Mictlan was less forgiving. It was a long journey, 9 levels, each harder than the last. Your soul was stripped of its memories, its name, its pain, and maybe, just maybe, its longings. The goal wasn't pleasure, but peace. Yet in the earlier stages of Mictlan, there are mentions, whispers really, of shadows embracing, of ghostly forms reliving old moments. Scholars argue about this. Was it metaphor? A final test of temptation? Or just the mind clinging to what it once had before the self dissolved completely? Now, here's something fringe. Some Aztec noble tombs included erotic objects. Not pornographic necessarily, but unmistakably sensual. Statuettes of couples entwined, fertility symbols, even perfumed cloths tucked into ceremonial jars. These weren't buried with shame, they were buried with honour, because the body was sacred, even in death. Denying its passions would be like denying the sun had heat. You see, the Aztecs didn't view sexuality as something to be left behind. It was one of the soul's many tools, a way of connecting, healing, offering. In the afterlife, it wasn't about carnal gratification, it was about energy, memory, identity. A warrior might carry the scent of his lover on his breath into the next world. A mother might bear the sound of her child's first cry and her heartbeat across the stars. These were the echoes of the body, the ghosts of touch. And yes, there were darker beliefs too. Some texts mention a Huitzotl, underworld creatures that tormented souls by mimicking the sounds of lovers lost. They'd lure the dead off their path with moans, sighs, whispered names. If you followed, you were trapped, forever haunted by a desire you could no longer satisfy. Were these demons? Echoes of memory? Guilt? Again, nobody agrees, but the idea that desire itself could become a trap, that stayed with people. And then there's the goddess Mictacasihuatl, Lady of the Dead. She ruled Mictlan alongside her skeletal husband Mictlantecutli. Depicted with flayed skin and wide eyes, she wasn't exactly seductive, but she was powerful. And some believe she could grant favours to souls who arrived with true longing in their hearts. Not lust, longing. The difference was everything. So, if you died mid-scandal, say in the middle of an affair gone wrong, or the night after a forbidden kiss, you carried that unfinished business into the next realm. It didn't torment you necessarily, but it became part of your journey. Some souls were believed to walk through the underworld holding invisible hands, chasing dreams they never fulfilled in life. One story, half erased from a codex but pieced together through oral retellings, tells of 2 women, both nobles, both forbidden to be together in life, who died in the same fire. In Mictlan, they refused to part. Over 9 levels, they held each other through floods, storms, and obsidian winds. At the end, when all names were shed, they were said to have merged into one soul, a hummingbird that danced endlessly across the sky, too fast to be caught, too beautiful to ignore. That's not doctrine, that's folklore, but maybe that's the point. Because even in the cold equations of death, the Aztecs allowed for mystery, for yearning, for the possibility that something of you, some spark of skin, heart, or memory, might keep reaching long after your body stopped, not as punishment, as persistence. You sit now before a tomb carved into the stone, its top weathered by time. Inside there's no body, only ashes, but beside it rests a carved figurine, 2 arms folded around a single drum. Above it, the glyph for sound of longing. Not a sound of grief, not a scream, just that ache. The one that even death doesn't silence. Because maybe what the Aztecs knew, and what we're still trying to understand, is that desire isn't just a spark of life. It's what echoes, even in the dark. So now we come to the final corridor, the last breath before the curtain falls. The stone beneath your feet is cracked with age, the murals along the walls half faded, as if they too are trying to forget what's about to come. Because this is the part of the story where everything breaks. The gods grow quiet, the rituals are interrupted mid-chant, and the Empire, once so obsessed with control, loses all of it in a matter of years. Tonight, we watch as the world of Aztec royalty collapses beneath a tidal wave of fire, steel, and unfamiliar shame. This is the fall of the flesh. It starts, as you might expect, with outsiders. When the Spanish arrived in 1519, led by Cortés and his starving sunburnt men, they didn't just bring muskets and disease, they brought an ideology of guilt. The Christian worldview they carried like a holy banner was one where sexuality, especially outside of marriage, outside of reproduction, outside of male dominance, was a sin. And not just a personal failing, a cosmic stain, something to be punished eternally. So imagine their horror, no, their delightful outrage, when they stepped into a world like Tenochtitlan, a city with temples to fertility goddesses, statues of naked lovers, state-sanctioned concubinage, erotic poetry etched into palace walls, and sex rituals performed in full view of the stars. This wasn't just alien to them, it was blasphemous. Proof in their minds that the Aztecs weren't just savages, they were perverts, corrupted, in desperate need of saving. And they got to work. The very first things destroyed were not always gold or idols, they were images, paintings, codices, scrolls, anything that showed bodies in positions deemed inappropriate. Temples of Xochiquetzal and Tlazolteotl were gutted or repurposed. Statues with rounded hips or too prominent breasts were smashed, buried, or recarved into crosses. The Feather Palace? Ransacked. The concubines? Taken, abused, or converted and renamed. Some forcibly married, others sent to cloisters where they were taught shame like it was a new language. The irony, of course, is that the Spanish weren't exactly prudish in practice. Many soldiers took indigenous wives or concubines themselves, often violently. Cortés himself fathered a child with La Malinche, an enslaved noblewoman turned interpreter, who was his translator, his lover, and, depending on who tells the story, his victim or his accomplice. Possibly both. But while they indulged, they erased. Overnight, the entire framework of Aztec sexuality was reframed as sin. Ritual acts were condemned as debauchery. The sacred temazcal became dens of temptation. Wet nurses were called whores. Priestesses were stripped and shamed. Even the codices that tried to explain the old beliefs were edited. Red ink scratching out breasts, thighs, symbols of fertility replaced with pious warnings in Latin. One friar, writing just decades after the conquest, described Aztec marriage as a thin veil over animal lust. Another wrote of the shameless women who danced naked for the moon and claimed to speak to her. A third burned 40 volumes of Nahua poetry because the metaphors were too moist. Yes, moist, let that sink in. But it wasn't just the Spanish who participated in the purge. Some Aztecs, particularly those desperate to survive, helped scrub their own culture. Nobles converted quickly, offering daughters to priests, publicly denouncing their old gods. They gave up their feathered robes for woolen tunics, traded poetry for psalms, and learned to carry their bodies like burdens instead of blessings. And yet, beneath all that ash, traces remained. Secret songs passed from grandmother to granddaughter, hidden in lullabies. Erotic imagery carved on the undersides of obsidian mirrors, visible only when held to firelight. Flowers drawn in such a way that only those trained in old glyphs would understand. This petal meant touch, that one meant yearning. Entire stories, written into the embroidery of shawls. There's one haunting record from a converted into priest decades later, who confessed in a private letter that he still dreamt of Tlazolteotl. "She comes to me," he wrote, "not as a demon, but as a woman who understands. She says my shame is not hers to carry." Even broken she remained. And here's the strange thing, the Spanish missed parts of it. The deeper, more tangled truths of Aztec sexuality were so unlike anything they knew, they often misunderstood them entirely. When they saw two men embracing in a ritual dance, they called it sodomy. They didn't know it was a reenactment of twin gods sacrificing themselves to restore balance to the world. When they found sacred bundles containing phallic statues, they labelled them obscene. They didn't realise these were fertility symbols buried with women to protect them in childbirth. They thought the Aztecs worshipped sex, but really the Aztecs respected it, honoured it, feared it, used it as a tool of balance, creation, punishment and transformation. For them it wasn't a secret, it was a system, until that system was shattered. You stand now at the ruins of what was once a garden dedicated to Mayahuel, the goddess of the maguey plant and of pleasure shared in drink. All that remains is a cracked stone basin, still faintly sweet with the memory of fermented sap. A few crushed petals blow across the ground, white, yellow, deep red. You bend, and beneath them find something half buried. A shard of painted clay no bigger than your palm. On it, two bodies curve into each other. Not obscene, not even detailed. Just a suggestion of closeness. A line here, a shoulder there, and at the centre, between them, a blooming flower. The message is still clear. Even after the empire burned, even after the gods fell silent, even after the invaders smeared shame across every inch of the body, they didn't erase everything, not completely. Some pieces refused to die, because desire is older than conquest, older than empires, older than shame. So here you are, at the end of the journey, curled beneath your blanket, the sound of your fan humming just behind you, and maybe that strange warm ache in your chest that comes from seeing too much, knowing too much, feeling just enough. You've made it through the obsidian labyrinth of Aztec royalty, desire, ritual, punishment, and power. Not bad, considering most people living it didn't exactly make it out alive. And now that the candles have burned low and the empire has crumbled behind you, let's take one last quiet look at what we've wandered through. Sex, in the Aztec world, wasn't taboo. It wasn't even private always. It was powerful, ritualized, woven into everything from the timing of eclipses to the arrangement of corn husks. It could bless you, doom you, purify you, or kill you, depending on the day of the calendar, your social class, and how many priests happened to be watching. It was never just sex. It was an offering, a tool, a currency, a secret weapon in the velvet corridors of empire. We saw emperors whose beds were battlefields, concubines who ruled with a glance, and jesters who knew laughter wasn't always innocent. We heard about shame tattoos, holy orgasms timed to Venus, and wet nurses whose lullabies outlasted dynasties. We learned how even in death, longing didn't let go, even in conquest. Some passions refused to be buried. And somewhere in all that, past the scandal, the silence, the ceremonial feasts, you probably found something uncomfortably familiar. Because while obsidian knives and blood-soaked altars may feel far away, the human part of the story doesn't. Power, risk, affection, jealousy, the quiet desire to be wanted, seen, touched, by someone who shouldn't, or by someone who always did. The Aztecs may be gone, their temples are dust, their names hard to pronounce, their gods mostly forgotten by the modern world, but the lives they lived, still pulsing under the surface, still rising like steam from a long cold temazcal, still whispering in feathered voices, in poetry scratched into ruined walls, in stories handed down with lowered voices and a half smile. So maybe tonight you'll dream of stone halls and painted courtyards, of noble women in jade and warriors who timed their kisses to the stars. Maybe you'll wander those palaces in your sleep, brushing past the ghosts of empires that lived boldly, lusted without apology, and built their world around the belief that flesh and spirit were never meant to be separate. And if you do, just remember, somewhere, under layers of ruin and centuries of silence, a flower still blooms in the stone, waiting to be found,